Do you think your skin color fits this neighborhood? Karen spat each word with venom, standing among the pristine white wedding chairs set up in my yard. I laughed and turned the sewage valve. The banquet tables sank into sludge, the white dresses turned black, and the arrogant HOA collapsed in disgrace. Sometimes justice doesn't come through word, through the satisfaction of exposing everything in front of a crowd. Tell me, what state are you in? I remember clearly it was a sweltering afternoon, the air thick and heavy after a day of relentless Sunday. The sky was still, shrouded in a hazy gray that blanketed the quiet neighborhood, with low-hanging clouds pressing down like a weight on our heads. After work, I drove slowly through the familiar curves that led home a tree-lined road where I used to tell myself, every drive back from work is a return to a safe place. All I was thinking about was the armchair in the corner of my living room, cold drink in hand, and that old jazz tune playing from the little speaker I'd bought just last weekend. I had planned a relaxing evening after hours of brain-numbing stress in a suffocating office. But as soon as my car turned into the familiar driveway, the entire scene shattered like a dream yanked violently from sleep. My vision darkened for a split second. Before the car had fully stopped, my heart was already pounding in shock. My front yard, the piece of land I had carefully seeded, edged, laid with stones, and nurtured like an extension of myself, now looked like the backdrop for some gaudy, low-budget ceremony. White ribbons were tangled and stretched everywhere, tied to metal stakes driven deep into the ground. Rows of white plastic chairs were lined up perfectly, as if ready to receive some crowd for a formal event. Even the lawn, my small, proud achievement, had been trampled without mercy to make room for a tacky, rainbow-colored flower arch so garish it was an insult to taste. It looked like a cruel joke, but no one jokes by setting up a wedding on your lawn without you knowing. I opened the car door in a daze, unsure whether I was awake or dreaming. The moment my heel hit the concrete, I felt the heat of the pavement shoot up through the soles of my feet, a mild but irritating burn that only added to the exhaustion already simmering inside me. My mind rang with unspoken questions. Who allowed this? Why my yard? And most importantly, why didn't anyone tell me? While I stood there stunned, a man in a faded t-shirt stepped out from the rows of chairs, holding a hammer. He whistled softly to himself, like he was enjoying the job without a care in the world. When our eyes met, he smiled. A shameless smile, part mockery, part provocation that made my blood boil like it had just been thrown onto a hot skillet. I walked straight toward him, trying to stay calm, but my voice was already hoarse with anger. "What the hell are you doing in my yard?" He scratched his head and shrugged like I just interrupted his flow. "Mrs. Wellington told us to prep the lawn for the wedding." Froze. That name, Karen Wellington, was all too familiar to anyone who had lived in this neighborhood for more than 3 days. President of the HOA, the Homeowners Association, was a woman who ran the community's rules, like a queen ruling over a petty kingdom. I'd heard a few stories about her. Letters warning people for hanging flags in the wrong spot, demands to repaint front doors because the color didn't match the neighborhood. Even a case where a family was forced to dismantle their backyard pool for not filing the proper paperwork. But I never thought the day would come when she'd move someone's entire wedding, probably her daughters, onto land that, on paper, was legally mine. I tried to swallow my anger, but the words cut their way out. "This is my property. Who gave you people the right to do this?" The worker didn't flinch, clearly used to being questioned. He shrugged and spoke each word like a line he'd memorized. "Oh, a president says she has authority." I clenched my fist. My chest tightened, like someone had grabbed my heart and squeezed. I looked up. The sky had darkened. Clouds hung low and heavy, ready to burst into a storm. I felt like I was living in a world where reason had cracked. These people, the ones behind this so-called community power, had decided that invading someone's personal space was normal. And the worst part? No one was saying a word. I looked around. A few neighbors stood in the shadows of their porches. An old woman held a garden sprayer, but clearly wasn't pressing the nozzle. A middle-aged man pretended to check an empty mailbox. Curiosity wasn't hidden, but neither was their indifference. As if this had happened before, or would happen again, and they had learned to keep their heads down. Their silence cut into me like a cold blade. I was alone in a confrontation no one wanted to witness. I turned back to the worker. His eyes were still blank. I gave the order, no longer bothering to stay calm. "Go get Mrs. Wellington. I want her to stand in front of me and explain that authority herself." He nodded slowly, then turned and walked off, unhurried. The way he moved told me everything. I saw it in his posture. He believed she would come, and that everything would go exactly the way they were used, imposed, unapologetic, and immune to the outrage of the one being trampled. But this time they were wrong. I'm not the kind of person who bows their head. I stood there in the yard, surrounded by a setup that felt like a stage party I never invited. The white ribbons fluttered slightly in the warm southern wind that carried a storm behind it. The fake flower arch swayed like a mockery. I felt like the villain dragged into the light just for daring to demand what was rightfully mine. But I wasn't born to play a supporting role. I wasn't about to let some wedding turn my land into a backdrop for arrogant abuse of power. From that moment on, I swore, if they had chosen my yard as their battleground, then I would fight, not with fists, but with the law, with logic, truth, and if necessary, with actions that would remind them, clearly and painfully, that some lines are never to be crossed. I walked straight into the yard, where the crew was busy erecting the flower art. The sun was beginning to set, the golden light of late afternoon casting long shadows across the ground, but it was still bright enough to see clearly the absurdity unfolding before my eyes. Metal frames stood upright, cold and sharp like fences from a military compound, jutting toward the sky, while bright green plastic vines twisted around them like fake snakes on a cheap theater set. From a distance, the whole mess looked like a flimsy screen that blocked the front of my house, the house I had poured all my money into, all my time, and a part of my youth just to call my own. On the lawn I had trimmed every single day, where I had bent down to pick up fallen leaves and pull out weeds one by one, they were now driving posts into the soil, even hanging a huge white wooden sign with bold red letters, "Happy Wedding." It looked more like a rundown public park or a pop-up carnival than the private yard of a home with an owner. Each hammer strike sounded like a blow to my dignity, like the echo of a funeral bell for the idea of ownership I thought I had paid for with real money. In the middle of it all, unmistakable and commanding, stood Karen Wellington. Her bright dyed blonde hair caught the light, and she stood at the center of my yard like a stage director, arms flailing with authority, her back rigid, chin lifted high as if the ground beneath her wasn't worthy of her feet. Her raised hand issued commands without a hint of tremble, practiced like she'd done it all her life. Maybe she had. Looking at her, I felt like I was staring down a dictator disguised as a neighbor, a self-crowned queen of the subdivision where every resident had learned to look away or bow their heads just to keep the peace. I moved straight toward her, each step hitting the stone path with purpose, stamping my presence into the scene. The blood in my veins hadn't cooled since that moment earlier, when I looked out my window and saw tarps and frames being hauled into my yard without a single word of warning or notice. Now that fire only burned hotter, seeing the ringleader standing dead center, as if this entire setup were perfectly normal. I didn't circle around it. My voice rang out firm and clear, cutting through the evening air. "What are you doing in my yard?" Karen turned. Her face wore that same smirk of mockery. Her eyes scanned me in an instant, then she answered slowly, deliberately stretching each word like she wanted every worker and every conveniently nearby neighbor to hear it loud and clear. "This space belongs to the community. You're just a new resident. Don't think buying a house means you get to do whatever you want." Her words dropped stones into still water, setting off a cascade of spirals in my head. I clenched my fists, partly to stay calm, partly to hold back the fury now cresting inside me. I answered, my voice low but drawn tight like a loaded bowstring. "The paperwork shows this is private property. I have everything I need to prove ownership." Karen didn't flinch. She didn't take a step back, didn't show a hint of hesitation or shame. Her eyes remained triumphant, as if I were nothing more than a small pawn just placed on the board. "Around here, the rules are mine. You'll learn that soon enough." The words were cold, shameless, and loaded with challenge. The air thickened. The trees stood silent. The only sounds were hammers striking, and the clatter of tools in the hands of workers who carried on like this was routine, as if they were used to these confrontations, and used to Karen winning. A few neighbors lingered in the distance, pretending to water plants or take evening strolls, but their eyes never left the scene unfolding in my yard. I felt judged, observed by a silent jury, the kind of looks that said nothing but knew everything, and chose to stay uninvolved. I took a deep breath, keeping my voice from breaking. "Mrs. Wellington, I don't know how long people here have tolerated this, but I'm not like this. Yard is my legal property, and anyone who turns it into a wedding stage will pay for it." She laughed a sharp, brittle laugh like broken glass. "You think you can scare me? I've run this place for 8 years. 8 years is long enough to make a few families sell and leave just for not following the rules. You think you're special? You're just the new guy. No friends, no ally, no voice. Around here, people trust me, not you." I stared straight into her eyes and saw the sick confidence in them. It wasn't just faith in her personal power, it was the belief that this place was her kingdom, and every resident was merely a subject expected to bow. But she was wrong. I didn't buy this house to bow. I didn't come here to stay silent. I've lived long enough to know that silence in the face of wrong only lets the wrong sink deeper. I clenched my jaw and answered firmly, "You might fool others with your title as HOA president, but not me. This is my land, and you're trespassing plain and simple." She waved me off and turned back to the workers. "Keep going. More flowers, more chairs in that corner. We need enough space for all the guests." A few of them hesitated, but then lowered their heads and continued. They didn't look at me, avoiding my eyes as if I were invisible. No one wanted to stand against Karen Wellington. That much clear. I stepped in front of her. "This is the last time I'll say it. If you don't stop, I'll call the police." Karen laughed again, full of contempt. "Go ahead. The police here all attend my party. You think they'll listen to some newcomer? Don't be naive." I turned my head, and sure enough, at the far edge of the yard, a few officers in uniform were chatting, drinking water, and laughing with the crew setting up chairs. None of them looked in my direction. No one cared that a black man's property was being violated in broad daylight. Cold pulse shot through my chest. Then Karen leaned in, her voice low and sharp as a blade. You should know your place around here. A newcomer, and with a skin color that most folks don't exact favor. Don't bring trouble on yourself. Those words made my head burn. It wasn't just an insult. It was the raw exposure of the rot at the core of the prejudice she held in her hands. I stood still for a few seconds, took a breath, and held back fury rising inside me like a volcano about to erupt. I lifted my head and answered firmly, if you think skin color defines my rights, then you're about to learn a different lesson. I've spent my whole life defending what's mine, and this time is no different. Karen narrowed her eyes, then gave a dry, mocking laugh. Just wait, I'll show you who really doesn't belong here. She turned away, the sound of her heels striking the stone walkway like a declaration of war. I stood there, watching that arrogant silhouette walk off, my mind quietly gathering every scattered thought into a plan. I knew I couldn't win in a shouting match, but this wasn't a shouting match. This was a war, and I was going to be the last one standing. I stepped out the front door, my breath heavy as if my chest were being crushed. In front of me, the white ribbons still fluttered in the wind, an endless taunt. Every neatly placed plastic chair looked like a makeshift barrier, yet strong enough to block my ownership in the very space I called mine. I couldn't take it anymore. Every ounce of restraint had reached its limit. I walked straight toward the fence, where a pale wooden sign hung proudly with bold letters reading, "Welcome Wedding." That stiff, all-caps lettering was a declaration. This land was no longer mine. The blood rushed to my face. My hand clenched the edge of the sign. A crack rang out. The sign popped off its hook. I ripped it down with every bit of fury burning inside me. The sound of wood hitting grass echoed loudly, followed by a sudden silence. Then came a shriek that sliced through the thick air. Karen Wellington lunged forward like a provoked animal, eyes bulging, her shrill voice tearing the quiet to shreds. You want to ruin my daughter's happiness? That sound startled a few nearby neighbors. One dropped her watering can. I saw windows crack open, curious eyes flickering behind curtains. The neighbors had heard it, and I understood Karen was shouting on purpose, turning this confrontation into a public spectacle. I turned and stared her straight in the face. The wooden sign is still in my hand, its welcome now smeared with dirt and grass. I dropped it onto the stone path. My voice rang out, each word sharp and deliberate. Kind of happiness is built on theft. A wave of murmurs stirred from the watching crowd. I saw a middle-aged man shake his head, but he didn't step forward. A young woman pulled her child back inside, eyes still fixed on us. They said nothing, and that silence infuriated me more than Karen's accusation. She stepped in close, her breath reeking of leftover wine from the wedding tasting earlier. She leaned so near I could see the wrinkles tightening around her curled lip. Then she spat out her words, slow and scornful, voice soaked in disgust. You don't belong here. Your skin never did. Those words shot straight into my ears, like a cold blade to the heart. For a moment, felt like the entire neighborhood went silent, and only that full sentence remained. It wasn't something said in a burst of anger, it was a barefaced statement from someone who had lived too long in privilege and prejudice. I looked straight into Karen's eyes, her pupils tight with contempt, and I knew she wasn't trying to win with bogus rules. She was trying to break me with hate that ran deep in her blood. I clenched my fists so tightly that my nails dug into my palms. I could feel the tremble building in my muscle, but I refused to let the rage take over. I lifted my head higher, my eyes locked on hers, and released each word like dropping slabs of stone. If this is the kind of happiness you claim, then it's rotten from the roots. And if you believe skin color defines my rights, then you'll be the first to learn the bitter lesson. Karen paused for a moment, then immediately sneered, her laugh whistling through clenched teeth, arrogant and shameless. She turned to the workers and barked orders as if I hadn't spoken at all. Keep building, move faster. The arch must be finished before night. Her voice was loud, deliberately so, meant for everyone to hear, meant to make me look small in a silent crowd. My chest felt like it might explode, the eyes of the neighbors pinned against my back, pitying, cautious. They had learned to bow, but I couldn't. I stepped forward and stomped down hard on the wedding sign lying at my feet. The wood cracked, the word wedding split in two. I spoke loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear. If anyone still thinks this land belongs to the community, look closely. This is my boundary, and anyone who crosses it is trespassing. There was a sharp inhale from someone nearby, but still, no one spoke against Karen. The silence wrapped around me like a wall, heavy and isolating, but it only stoked the fire inside me. I knew one thing for sure: if I backed down today, I'd lose everything tomorrow. Karen wouldn't stop at the yard. She would keep pushing, inch by inch, benefit by benefit, until there was nothing left of what was mine. Karen spun around, her eyes narrowing into razor-sharp slits. Her voice cut through the air, loud enough for the entire block to hear. You think you can go against me? You're dead wrong. This is my community. I've broken people twice as stubborn as you. And so, I didn't look away, fired back instantly. This This community doesn't belong to you. It belongs to everyone, and you are no queen. You're just someone clinging to the HOA's power to serve your ego and exploit others. The atmosphere split in two. Some neighbors stepped back, unsettled by the confrontation. But a few eyes lit up, like they had waited far too long to hear someone say what needed saying. Karen's face flushed red, veins rising in her neck, yet she forced a crooked smile, a smile that drilled itself into my mind like a nail. You'll regret this. Tomorrow, you'll get a violation notice for damaging HOA property and for disturbing the peace. I'll show you just how expensive defiance can be. I stepped closer, my voice booming, every word hitting like a hammer. Tomorrow, you'll have to look at yourself in the mirror. But today, I'll say this clearly. I don't fear fines. I don't fear the HOA. I only despise those who use power to crush others, and I will not bow. Karen stared at me, eyes blazing, but I caught a flicker of hesitation. Maybe she wasn't used to being called out publicly, to hearing someone peel back her mask in front of everyone. I knew this moment would echo through the neighborhood. She wanted to turn me into a joke, but I had just made her show her face. A strong wind blew through, the white ribbons clashing against each other with a high-pitched hiss, like mocking whistles. I looked around and saw a few neighbors silently nod at me before turning back into their homes. They weren't ready to stand up to Karen in public, but those eyes told me they had seen, they had heard, and they understood. I turned back to Karen, a cold smile flickering on my lips. This community won't stay silent forever. Enjoy your power today, but tomorrow it'll vanish like soap bubble. Karen lifted her chin and walked away, her voice trailing behind her, sharp and lingering. We'll meet again. I watched her go, my blood still boiling. I knew this fight had only just begun. But in that moment, when those racist insults echoed through the entire neighborhood, I made a decision I wasn't going to let Karen Wellington win. Not just for me, but for everyone whose dignity she had crushed beneath her feet far too long. If your land was taken and your worth insulted in broad daylight, would you swallow the shame or explode? The next morning, just as I opened the door to grab the newspaper, before the early sunlight could even stretch across the last step of the porch, my eyes locked on a strange object sitting inside the mailbox by the gate. A card. Glossy white paper, with gaudy gold-trimmed edges, reeking of cheap perfume like someone had sprayed an entire can of air freshener directly onto it before tossing it in. I pulled it out, it open, and my eyes were immediately struck by raised gold foil letters. You are cordially invited to a wedding celebration at 245 Sycamore, front yard of our family home. I read it again, then a third time, as if my brain refused to process what it saw. No, this wasn't a mistake, wasn't some dumb prank from the neighbor's kid. This was blatant occupation. A move so brazen, so entitled, it turned my private property into the community's wedding venue, as if I were the hired help, forced to loan out the master's lawn for a party. I clenched the invitation, folding it until the edges crumpled and broke. Felt like holding clear proof of a crime, yet the criminal made no effort to hide. Karen Wellington, no one else could have come up with something this outrageous. My name wasn't mentioned anywhere on the card. No request. No, with the kind permission of the homeowner. Instead, a shameless declaration, with the approval of the HOA. She clearly wanted everyone to believe the yard, the gate, the lawn, every inch of my property was public space, under her authority to use as she pleased. The whole neighborhood would read it, take it as fact, and if I objected, I'd be cast as the one against the community. I couldn't stay still. The feeling of being disrespected, of having my basic rights stripped from me on my own land, pushed my legs to move. I walked straight to the largest house at the end of the street. Karen's house, a faux classical cream structure with heavy wooden doors, European-style tile roof, and a circular flower bed trimmed so precisely it looked like a miniature opera stage for the tiny lion statues flanking it. Each stone along the walkway was spotless, as if freshly polished, but all that shine only added to my disgust, as if every detail had been built not to impress, but to declare, I rule this place. I knocked 3 firm times on the door. The sound echoed through the wooden frame, loud enough to carry across the block like a battle cry. After a moment, the door creaked open. Karen appeared, wearing an ivory silk robe, holding a wine glass in her hand, early in the morning. She looked at me with a gaze that said she had been expecting this moment, the corner of her mouth lifting. You got here fast. I assume you received the invitation. Congratulations. Your yard is about to become the centerpiece of an event the whole neighborhood will be proud of. I raised the card to eye level. My hand trembled slightly, but my voice landed with the weight of steel. You printed my home address on this? This is outright theft. Karen showed no surprise. She took a sip of wine, exhaled lightly like a passing breeze, then shrugged and said, You should be proud. Not everyone gets the honor of donating their yard for such a grand occasion. This wedding will raise the neighborhood's value, and you, even without doing a thing, will benefit. Everyone will see that you contributed. Her voice poured like honey laced with acid, sweet and burning in my throat. I clenched the invitation so tightly the paper sliced into my finger, drawing a thin line of blood. I couldn't swallow the anger boiling in my chest. I spoke bluntly. I didn't contribute anything. This is my property. I paid for it with real money, and I do not consent to you turning it into a banquet hall. This is theft, Karen. Theft in broad daylight. She stepped back, set her wine glass glass on the wooden table behind the door, then moved closer to me close enough that I could smell the thick perfume mixed with the alcohol on her breath. But she didn't lower her voice. She spoke loudly and clearly, loud enough for the neighbors walking their dogs to hear. You think you can stop it? The whole block got the invitation. Everyone's excited for the event. If you dare interfere, you'll be going against the entire neighborhood. And believe me, around here, no one sides with you. My chest felt like it might explode. You're turning yourself into a joke. One day, the whole block will turn its back on you. Karen tilted her head, smiling a razor-thin smile that cut like a blade, just grazing skin. That day will never come. I am the law here. Then she turned, her silk robe brushing lightly over the stone floor, and the heavy wooden door closed with a loud slam, like the gavel at the end of a trial where I was the one condemned. I stood there, fists still clenched, my face burning, breath ragged. Felt like I had been slapped in public, with no one saying a word. I looked down at the crumpled invitation in my hand, then imagined the wedding day. My yard packed with white chairs, strangers laughing, photographers marching across my lawn, and my daughter forced to hide inside, unable to stand the absurdity. Thought twisted my gut, painful, humiliating. I turned away and walked home, each step heavy as stone. Along the way, a few neighbors glanced at me. An elderly woman gave a stiff nod. A man pushing a stroller lowered his gaze. No one spoke, no one asked. I could see the fear in their eyes and familiarity. They knew what was happening, but they wouldn't interfere. Karen had long used the HOA like a whip to punish anyone who stepped out of line, and the neighborhood had grown used to bowing its head. When I got home, I stopped in the yard. The chairs were still being arranged. Flower arch still stood tall. The workers going like I didn't exist. I took a deep breath. The smell of paint, plastic, and dust rose from the materials and filled my lungs, dizzying. I no longer felt the same rage I had that morning. What settled in was something colder, sharper clarity. I couldn't count on justice from the HOA. Couldn't expect the neighbors to step up. Couldn't afford the fantasy of fairness. If anyone was going to stand up, it had to be me. Karen believed she had the crowd behind her, but I had the truth. And I had legal ownership. As long as I stayed patient, step by step, piece by piece, I would turn the table. I went back inside, placed the invitation in a drawer, opened a note, and began recording every word, every action. I knew I couldn't overpower the whole neighborhood on my own, but I had more than enough to bring down one person. That morning, just as the sun began to rise, the first sound I heard wasn't birdsong or rustling leaves. It was the sharp growl of a luxury engine rumbling outside the narrow road leading to my house. I pulled back the curtain, through the window, and saw a scene that froze the blood in my vein. A line of gleaming luxury cars, SUVs, and sedans parked in perfect formation. Groups of guests, dressed to impress, stepped out holding wedding gifts, wide smiles on their face, and they casually strolled through the gate of my yard as if entering a private event venue. I threw open the door and rushed onto the porch. In front of me, fake flower arch had been completed the night before, and rows of white plastic chairs now stretched across the entire lawn. My front yard had become a full-fledged wedding venue. Felt like I was drowning in a nightmare. Every step the guests took on my lawn stomped down on my ownership. I ran forward, blocking the path, arms stretched wide, my voice sharp and low. Stop right there. This is my private property. Everyone needs to leave. The guests looked puzzled. Some frowned. Others let out scoffing laugh. Then the crowd parted, revealing a familiar figure. Karen Wellington, wearing a light-colored silk dress, stepped out like a victim. She showed no hint of embarrassment, on the contrary. She lifted a microphone attached to a portable speaker, her voice ringing out, syrupy sweet and dripping with mockery. Welcome everyone, to the heart of the community. The amplified sound drowned out my shout. The crowd erupted into applause, a rattle of clapping that echoed through the neighborhood. Each clap was like a hammer striking, silencing every word I tried to say. I felt my chest tighten, not from fear, but from humiliation. My yard, the land I had bought and cared for every day, had become Karen's stage flaunting her power. I screamed, but the speaker and the crowd swallowed my voice whole. Karen turned to me, still smiling, her eyes flashing with triumph. She spoke into the microphone, her voice ringing like she was delivering a sermon packed tall. Isn't it wonderful that our community comes together to share in this joy? This is proof of our unity, our spirit of connection. I lost it. I shouted, "What unity? This is blatant trespassing. This is my house." But the crowd had already been swept away. They cheered, they laughed, my words scattered like dust in the wind. Then I noticed something that made my stomach cold. Near the edge of the yard, by the fence, stood a few figures in local police uniform. Arms folded, they stood still, their expressions blank, eyes shifting away when I looked directly at them. They didn't move to maintain order, didn't step in to stop the chaos. They just stood there like statues, their presence silently declaring that Karen had backing. I understood immediately they weren't there to protect. They were a shield for Karen. Their presence was as good as a seal of approval. I saw something in their eyes that looked like shame, but there was also fear. They knew this was wrong, but they were compromised or worse, convinced by Karen through some means. Blood rushed to my head, and I shouted, "What do you wear that uniform for? To stand there and watch my land get taken, then pretend it's legal?" One of them shrugged slightly and turned away. The other stared at me for a few seconds, then lowered his gaze in silence. They chose not to speak, and that silence hit like a thunderous slap. Karen Karen, of course, didn't miss the opportunity. She lifted the microphone, sneering. You see? Even the police are here today. Who would dare say this is wrong? Let's all enjoy this special day. Crowd cheered, their laughter rising like a mocking chorus. I felt every muscle in my body tremble. The feeling of being surrounded, swallowed by a crowd with no allies, only a burning fury left behind. I knew I was alone, but I didn't feel afraid. The rage had replaced everything else. I stepped closer to Karen and snatched the microphone from her hand. The clapping died down. A few people gasped. I shouted into the mic, my voice heavy and thunderous. This is my home, my land. Mrs. Wellington and everyone enabling her are trespassing. I'm warning all of you, you will be held accountable under the law. The sound echoed through the speaker, hissing into every ear. I saw a few faces pause, some glances falter. Karen didn't back down. She snatched the mic back, laughing viciously. You think you're scaring anyone? Everyone can see this is a wedding, a celebration. You're standing here against the whole community. You're making yourself the outsider. The crowd clapped again, though it lacked the wild energy from before. I saw people glancing at one another, confusion clearly settling in. The truth I had spoken had planted a seed of doubt. Karen was still too loud, still hiding behind her mask power. I took a deep breath and locked eyes with her. You can fool others with your community mask, but I see through it. This wedding isn't raising the value of the neighborhood. It's inflating your diseased ego. Karen flushed red but quickly regained her composure. She turned to the crowd, her voice high and theatrical. Did you hear that? He called me diseased. Does someone like that deserve to live in this neighborhood? The crowd stirred again, some giggled, some whispered in agreement, but I also caught a few stray remarks. He's not wrong. It is private property. That's just too much. Turning someone's yard into a wedding site. Those murmurs were small glimmers of light in a dark fog, but I clung to them. I knew I hadn't lost. Back, eyes scanning the motionless police still standing at the edge. I spoke loudly, without the mic. I'm not afraid of being the one the neighborhood turns against. What I fear is your silence when you see what's wrong, and still look away. You're cheering for abuse of power, and one day, you'll be the ones it turns on. The entire block fell quiet for a few seconds. The wind rushed through the white ribbons, their rustling sounding like a chorus of mocking whistles. Karen gripped the microphone tightly, eyes burning, but I could see the strain behind her smile. I had forced her to hold up the mask in front of a crowd that was beginning to see through it, but the fight wasn't over. The wedding would still happen, the guests were still present, and the police remained as decoration. I understood that I couldn't stop it at this moment, but every word I had spoken was now etched into the minds of those watching. The wedding might go on, but it would never be the perfect celebration Karen imagined. It would be the day people started asking questions, and those questions would be the blades pierced through her mask. I walked back into the house, my blood boiling but my spirit unbroken. I knew this was only the surface. Karen might win for now through force, but I would win through truth. I swore to myself, this forced wedding day would be the first nail in the coffin of her power. I no longer had the patience to hear a single word from Karen Wellington. As the crowd kept chatting and laughing, as the background music from the speakers started blaring out cheap wedding melodies, I stepped directly into the center of the pathway, arms spread wide, blocking the entrance like a living wall. My voice rang out, hoarse but unwavering. Everyone get off my lawn. The words dropped like a stone, freezing the air for a few seconds. Some guests froze mid-step, and a few exchanged confused glances. Then, sharp and shrill, Karen's voice pierced through the speaker. Everyone, look, he's ruining the wedding. Her voice, amplified, cut through the air like a blade. The crowd stirred. A woman in a formal gown shouted, "How shameless. This is a celebration." A middle-aged man smirked and muttered, "He has no dignity." Their words didn't shake me. They only fueled the fire. Without hesitation, I raised my hand, pointed straight at Karen's face, and said, word grating with force, "What's outrageous is turning my home into a circus stage." The yard went silent for a beat. Her eyes flashed with anger, but she forced a mocking smile. The crowd began to murmur, and more guests pulled out their phones. Cameras now pointed at us. I heard the click photos, the beeps of video recordings. The tension in the air was thick enough to hear the rhythm of everyone's breathing. A strong gust of wind blew through, sending white ribbons flapping and plastic chairs knocking together. The scene looked like a coliseum, with me and Karen standing at either end, while the audience watched, ready for a clap. I could feel my heart pounding hard, but my voice stayed steady. Each sentence landed like a hammer striking arrogant. Karen gripped the microphone tightly, her voice hissing through clenched teeth. "See this? He's here, screaming, ruining a joyous day. This is the kind of man you all have to live with." A faint round of applause came from her closest friend, trying to cover the awkward silence from the rest. I heard a few children giggling, some adults whispering. One person asked, "Is this really private property?" Another answered, "I heard it. It's his yard." Those murmurs snaked through the crowd like embers under ash. I looked around, my eyes sweeping across the faces fixed on me. I raised my voice. directing it straight into the microphone still in Karen's hand. If you believe you're in the right, why do you need to shout over me? If this truly is a community, then where is the proof that this yard is shared land? I have documents, and I'll say it clearly right now, this is private property, and everything happening today is trespassing. A wave of murmurs rose. Some guests lowered their head, suddenly uneasy. A few stopped recording, their eyes shifting. Karen's face flushed red, her grip on the microphone so tight her fingers turned white. She shouted, voice trembling but still dripping with arrogance. You think you can threaten me? You just moved in. No one even knows who you are. I'm the one who keeps order here, and everyone listens to me. Oh, I stepped forward, now face to face, the distance between us no more than half a meter. I looked straight into her eyes, my voice dropping low, cold as ice. Listening to you, I see someone who's crowned herself ruler, not a keeper of order. What you're clinging to is nothing more than the silence of those too afraid to speak. But that silence ends today. The yard fell dead silent. Only the wind hissing through the flower arch and the faint clicking of cameras remained. I caught a few flickers of agreement in the crowd, some quick nods that vanished just as fast, but they were enough to tell me I wasn't alone. Karen might still be cheered by some, but the cracks had begun to show. Karen scoffed, tilted her head, and replied with a voice full of challenge. You think anyone here will stand with you? This whole neighborhood belongs to me. Even the police are here. They've seen everything. What exactly do you plan to do? I turned to face the group of officers still standing with arms crossed. I spoke loudly, without a microphone, clear enough for everyone to hear. You're witnessing a blatant act of trespassing. You wear uniforms, carry badges, and yet you stand there watching my land get stolen. Tomorrow, when this video is everywhere, what will you say? More phones were raised, their lenses turning toward the officers. They exchanged glances, eyes uneasy. One adjusted his hat, another furrowed his brow. They didn't respond, and that silence said more than any excuse ever could. Karen clenched her teeth, covering it with a bitter laugh. See? Now he's threatening the police. What kind of person like that deserves a place in this neighborhood? I answered without pause, cutting her off before she could regain control. Someone like me at least respects other people's boundaries. And you'll be remembered as the one who turned a wedding into a circus and a community into your personal stage, satisfy a sick hunger for power. Few gasps rippled from the corners of the crowd. One man let out a laugh, then quickly covered his mouth. A woman whispered to her friend, he's not wrong. Those quiet voices lit the air like sparks catching flame, spreading fast through the crowd's silence. Karen staggered for a brief second, quickly straightened up and shouted into the microphone. Enough. You'll pay for what you said today. I promise everyone, this saboteur will be dealt with under HOA law. I gave a cold smile, then spoke loudly. You talk so much about HOA law, but the real law, the law of this country is on my side, and when the truth comes out, no one will believe in your made-up rules anymore. The entire yard buzzed with rising chatter. Phones kept cording, and I knew every word I spoke was being saved, spreading, becoming undeniable evidence. Karen Wellington might win for now with her microphone and the crowd she'd whipped up, but that power was already beginning to tremble. The tension in the air was suffocating. Every glance, every breath, every whisper felt like a match waiting to strike. I stood firm in the yard, facing Karen, thinking to myself, this farce has gone on long enough, and it's time it ended. The noise in the crowd hadn't yet settled after the face-to-face standoff when Karen Wellington suddenly raised the microphone, her eyes flashing with challenge. She turned toward the guest, her voice booming, sharp as a blade. This is a textbook example. An outsider destroying the value of our neighborhood. The accusation dropped like a spark into dry leaves, igniting the entire yard. A group of guests near the front, familiar faces who had always sided with Karen during HOA meetings, immediately burst into applause. Laughter echoed not the sound of joy, but the cruel laughter of people who enjoyed watching someone get dragged through the mud. I scanned the faces, saw smug glances, wide, cold grins, and I knew Karen had just shoved me into the trap she had laid. My blood boiled, my throat clenched, but my voice came out like thunder. Discrimination won't cover the filth of your power. I shouted loud enough to drown out the laughter, loud enough for every person there, even those secretly filming, to hear every word. I wasn't speaking to earn applause. I was speaking to expose the truth, right in the middle of the crowd. The air went still for a beat. Few guests flinched, and some phones shook in trembling hands. A child seated on a chair turned to his mother, eyes filled with questions. The silence hung for a few seconds, heavy as a hammer. Then Karen jerked her chin, brought the mic close to her lips, and spat out each word with venom. You're just an outsider. If you know what's good for you, shut your mouth. The yard buzzed with murmurs. Few clapped weakly. Some half-laughs trickled through, but I caught the other expressions uneasy, uncomfortable. Some guests avoided eye contact. Others leaned toward one another and whispered. Karen had tried to strike me down with her usual weapon-veiled prejudice, but she didn't realize that, by saying it aloud, in public, she had stripped her mask. I stepped forward, my hand hand clenched, my voice louder than the entire speaker system. You can call me an outsider, but it's you who disgraces this place. No one drags this neighborhood down more than an HOA president who turns someone else's lawn into a private stage for her sick hunger for control. The words cut through the air like a blade. I saw a few faces go pale, some lowered their phones, others dropped their hands and stopped filming. The clapping faded, replaced by a tense silence. Karen froze for a moment, her face flickering with uncertainty, then forced a bitter, hollow smile. I kept going, not giving her a moment to breathe. I think their silence is agreement, but you're wrong. They fear you. They want no trouble. But deep down, everyone here sees the rot in how you run this place. And today, you said it out loud that prejudice is your tool. That's your confession, and I'll carve it into the memory of everyone standing here. No one was laughing anymore. The wind whipped through the fake flower arch, sounding like fabric tearing from a stage. The guests who had been gleeful moments ago now looked hesitant, few lowering their heads, pretending to adjust their clothes. I saw a tall man in the back row, silent since the beginning, give me a slight nod before quickly turning away. It was a small gesture, but it spoke volumes. Someone had heard, someone had seen. Karen tried to regain control. She raised the microphone, her voice sharp and bitter. You dare call me a disgrace? You think you'll last here long? I have the authority to issue violations, to list you as non-compliant, and you'll be forced to leave in shame. I gave a cold smile, one that made her instinctively step back half a pace. I'm not afraid of threat, but you should fear the truth. And the truth is, right here, right now, you've shown your true face, broadcasted your prejudice to the neighbor, to the world, through every phone filming this. The yard erupted in murmurs, phones lifted higher, eyes locked on Karen, waiting to see how she would react. She swallowed hard, her face flushing red, but she held her ground. You think a few videos can take me down? Crushed louder opposition than you. I raised my chin, scanned the crowd, and said with a voice like iron, you've silenced those who stayed quiet, who never had the chance to speak, but you can't silence the truth. And today, you recorded your own downfall with the very microphone in your hand. The tension reached its breaking point. The air thickened like it was ready to snap. I saw a few guests rise and leave, unwilling to take part in the farce any longer. An elderly woman shook her head, pulled her daughter away. The cracks were visible now, and Karen knew it. She screamed, her mic squealing with feedback. Listen to me, this is still a wedding. Don't let him ruin it. But her voice no longer carried command. It was the panicked cry of someone losing control. I stood still, eyes locked on her, then turned to the crowd and said loudly, you can laugh at me, call me an outsider, but at least I still have dignity. She buried the dignity of this entire neighborhood under arrogance and prejudice. And one day soon you'll have to decide, bowing your heads or stand tall. The words dropped and echoed into a long silence. Eyes flickered, hands tightened, and I knew the spark had caught. Karen could keep screaming, but the shame she had hurled was now bouncing back, exposing the rot she had tried to bury. I took a deep breath, heart pounding like war drums, but my mind was sharp. I didn't need to win today. I just needed witnesses, people who heard every word she said, loud and clear. And I had that. Karen stepped back. The microphone slipped from her hand, hitting the ground with a sharp crack. She stared at me, eyes full of hatred, but I saw something else behind it. Fear. She had crossed a line, and she knew it. I turned and walked back into the house, cutting through the silent crowd. My back burned from the eyes following me, but this time, I didn't feel alone. I felt the crack I had carved. And from that crack, Karen's entire facade would collapse. If your land were taken and you were openly humiliated, would you swallow your pride or explode? The air in the yard was thick, almost like fog. The scent of cheap fume mixed with early opened wine, the smell of grass crushed beneath high heels and polished leather shoes, all came together to form a pungent essence of a ceremony meticulously arranged, utterly soulless. The hushed murmurs felt like waves washing against the back of my neck, the only man not dressed for a party, the only one standing in the crowd who clearly didn't belong. The rows of white chairs, aligned neatly under the harsh sun, looked like an audience at some religious ritual I had never consented to. Curious eyes, equal parts eager and pitying, locked onto me and Karen, two main characters never written into the script. And amid it all, phones raised high, lenses sweeping nonstop as if waiting for that one viral moment to splash across social media the moment I, the legal owner of this yard, would be cast out during the so-called big day of the woman crowned herself queen of the neighborhood. Fake floral arch rose at the head of the walkway, its white ribbons fluttering in the breeze as if trying to veil the absurdity they represented. On the small stage, a man in a deep navy suit stepped forward, holding a microphone like a seasoned performer. He cleared his throat with practiced precision, then spoke with a voice carefully trained, forcing in a false enthusiasm. Ladies and gentlemen, today is a special day, a day where love is celebrated before the eyes of the community. He hadn't finished his line when I saw Karen tilt her head slightly toward me, her lips moving just enough for me to hear, and no one else. He's just a tool for my big day. That sentence landed in my ear like a hammer strike. But I wasn't stunned. I wasn't hurt. My ears rang not from humiliation, but from the fire of fury rising inside me, hotter than ever. Tool, that word bored in like a drill. I, the owner of this land, the man who had carefully measured every blade of grass, who had endured insult after insult, who had been ignored more times than I could count, was now being called a tool, prop for her to parade her power, to elevate the delusion of authority this neighborhood had long bowed to. I didn't shout, I didn't lash out. Instead, I laughed a cold, biting laugh that sliced through the air like a razor. A tool, huh? Fine. You'll see how this tool operates. Karen froze for a beat. Her eyes widened for a single second, a rare flash of weakness slipping through the layers of makeup and arrogance. But then she turned away, as if she hadn't heard a thing, masking the tremor behind a straight spine and a polite smile for her guest. I knew she still believed she had everything under control, from the crowd to the HOA, even the cops standing off in the distance, the same ones I'd seen shaking her hand just yesterday. But she didn't know I had been waiting for this day a long time. Like an old soldier, I didn't speak up when suppressed, didn't strike until I was sure of the outcome, but I was always ready to counterattack when cornered. I stepped away from the scene, quietly walking to the back of the house. No one stopped me. No one noticed everyone was wrapped up in the wedding music, the clinking of glasses, the gentle tap of heels on the brick patio. I walked down the narrow stone path I had laid myself, my shadow stood long in the sun, each step steady like a march into the trenches. I remembered the area where I had renovated the drainage system. The day Karen declared in front of everyone, "I make the rules here." I understood someone like her would never stop, unless someone stood in her way, and I had been ready since that day. Behind the wooden fence at the back of the yard, beneath a heavy iron lid, lay the regulation valve system I had hired a technician to install discreetly. It connected the main drainage line to an offshoot that led to an old technical waste pit, abandoned, deep, and reeking of rot, but still functional if needed. I didn't build it to destroy. I built it for defense. Because when dealing with someone like Karen, you couldn't rely on rules alone, you needed the power to resist. I knelt down, my hand pressed to the cold metal valve. The freezing surface sent a chill up my palm. I felt every tendon tighten, blood rushing to my head, my heart pounding hard. But there was no confusion in my mind. I thought of my daughter, sitting inside, windows shut, forced to stay hidden from the crowd out of shame. I thought of all the times Karen laughed in my face, the silent stares of neighbors who said nothing when I was humiliated. And I thought of that whisper, calling me a tool, the final contempt meant to push me past the edge. Fine, if I'm a tool, I'll function on my own terms, not to serve her, but to end this absurd spectacle. I gripped the valve, feeling pressure coil in my wrist. Just a slight twist, and the black water would surge up, seeping through the cracks in the brick, soaking dresses, flooding fine leather shoes, dismantling the pristine illusion of the wedding she had so carefully constructed. I could already picture Karen standing in the middle of it all, soaked gown clinging to her, black water dripping from her hair to her shoulders, her gaze stripped of triumph, left with nothing but the raw fear of being dethroned. I looked up at the sky, a blazing blue with not a cloud in sight. The microphone still echoed from the front. Something about sacred moment, something about community consensus. I exhaled deeply, then whispered to myself, this will be the reckoning that silences the whole neighborhood. I didn't need to yell, didn't need to hit anyone. All I needed was action. Just one turn of the valve and the stage would collapse. In this moment, I was no longer the one being overrun. I was the one holding the scales of justice, if only once in my life. And if Karen Wellington had ever believed she was untouchable today, it would be her own arrogance that became the trap she walked into. I closed my eyes, took one long breath. The turn was right there in my grasp. All that remained was one final question. If it were you, would you let it go, or would you bring the curtain down right here at the wedding? I kept my hand on the valve for a few more seconds, inhaled deeply, my chest tightening, then summoned every ounce of strength and twisted it hard to the right. A bone-chilling creak echoed from beneath the earth, followed by a gurgling noise like a beast awakened after years of slumber. The underground current surged, trembled, then erupted without warning. Thick, foul-smelling black stream blasted out from the buried pipes I had already rerouted, gushing into the front yard like a flood. It roared forward, sweeping away the red carpet lining the aisle, lifting it like a torn piece of cloth. The banquet tables were wiped out in seconds, the once pristine white linens soaked in dark brown filth, crystal plates shattered, their sharp clinks swallowed by frantic screams. Guests scrambled in all directions, and rows of chairs collapsed like dominoes. Some tripped, clothes stained, clawing to get back on their feet. The women in long dresses trampled each other, heels skidding on the wet grass, creating a chaos unlike anything this street had ever seen. The cheers and chatter morphed into shrieks, heavy breathing, and muttered curses. I emerged from behind the house, stepping across the soaked stone tiles, the stench of sewage and mud punching up my nostrils. In the chaos, Karen Wellington stood frozen in the middle of the yard, her eyes wide in disbelief. She was still wearing the bright white gown she had forced herself into to appear as some self-appointed queen, but now it looked no different from a rag dragged through a sewer. Filthy water splashed around her, spreading brown stains upward, transforming the pristine dress into a grimy mop. Karen screamed, her voice cracking. My dress! Clutched at the fabric, but the tighter she pulled, the deeper the mud soaked in. Her carefully styled blonde hair now hung limp and plastered to her. The woman who had stood so smug smug just moments before, was now a dripping, shivering puppet caught in the center of the stage she built for herself. I stood tall amid the filth, head high, eyes locked on the remnants of the crowd. My voice rang out, deep and unshakable, cutting through the panic. This isn't a wedding. This is my land. The words struck like a bell, shattering the illusion. I saw a few neighbors gape open-mouthed. One even burst into laughter. Then, from a corner of the yard, came a dry, gleeful chuckle, sharp, satisfied. It spread. A few more joined, then a full chorus of uncontrollable laughter. Not at me, but at Karen, at the crumbling farce of power now drowning in mud. I took a breath, scanning the scene. The once elegant guests now stumbled about, clothes streaked with filth. Some cursed under their breath, others their shoes and bolted toward the gate. A couple of videographers tried to hold steady, but their hands shook, unable to film while laughing. I knew without a doubt within hours this entire spectacle would flood social media. Karen staggered, trying to cling to the fake floral art, but the arch couldn't withstand the weight of the water, either it collapsed. Plastic flowers were scattered, smeared with mud, draped across her gown. Her scream was lost in the waves of laughter around her. All she could do was flail in the filth she had brought upon herself. I stepped forward a few more paces, letting my voice rise above the noise. You can call me an outsider, treat me like a tool, but today, this entire neighborhood will remember you as the one drowned in disgrace on your so-called special day. This is the price for trampling over someone else's boundary. Laughter from the crowd swelled louder. A man near the fence clapped 3 times, then others joined in. In their eyes, I saw the flicker I had waited for recognition. They had once feared Karen, once kept silent, but now, no one held her in esteem. The police stood off to the side, faces pale. They didn't move, but their discomfort was written plainly in their eyes. One of them turned away quickly, dodging a camera lens. I knew they too realized they had been dragged into this mess. Their silent complicity had been recorded, and would be ridiculed along with Karen. Karen screamed in vain. "You'll pay for this. I'll sue you. I'll ruin you." But her voice had lost all weight. Drenched in a shredded wedding gown, face streaked grime, eyes wide with panic, she was no longer the ruler. She was a pitiful wreck, an emblem of self-destruction through unchecked power. I turned to face the crowd again, my voice clear and resolute. Anyone who dares enter my home without knocking, who dares seize this yard like it's owed to them, face the same end. This is not HOA land. This is mine. A shout of agreement rang out from somewhere in the crowd, then a few more followed. There was no more mocking of me, only mockery aimed at Karen. I knew then that this scene had buried the hollow authority she had spent years trying to build. The water pouring, spreading across the yard. I didn't rush to shut it off. I let the filthy flood cleanse every trace of the fabricated celebration. The white chairs floated like debris, flowers stained, the once elegant tables now nothing but heaps of soggy trash. The entire front lawn, once declared the heart of the community, now stood as a vivid testament to the truth. No one could steal my boundary. When I finally turned the valve and stopped the flow, the front yard had become a battlefield mud, wreckage, and ragged breathing. Guests thinned out, leaving behind a few dazed stragglers, none daring to meet my eye. Karen stood motionless amid the ruin, the shattered microphone lying useless at her feet. I stepped forward, stopping a few meters from her, and spoke loud and steady, my voice calm but ice cold. "Mrs. Wellington, from this day forward, no one will remember your daughter's wedding. They'll remember the day you were drowned in filth on my front lawn. You brought this on yourself, and I simply returned it to where it belonged." She trembled, her lips moved, but no words came out. The entire neighborhood saw it, and the whole community bore witness. And I knew, in that moment, power she had so arrogantly clung to for so long had fractured beyond repair. The triumphant laughter continued, echoing outward, mixing with murmurs and whispers until it swelled into an unstoppable wave. The day Karen Wellington had planned as a monument to the grandeur of the HOA had become the day she signed the death warrant of her own reign. And I stood there in the mud, no longer feeling shame, but a deep and steady. The chaos in the yard hadn't even begun to settle when Karen Wellington's shrill scream rang out, sharp as metal scraping glass, distorting the already frenzied atmosphere into something warped and suffocating. She stood in the middle of a muddy puddle, her ivory wedding gown stained and streaked brown sludge, clutching a broken microphone that crackled with piercing static. Her face was twisted with panic and unchecked fury, her eyes wild like an animal cornered in its cage. She shrieked, bitter and venomous. "You ruined my daughter's life." The accusation landed like a blade hurled into the scattered crowd that remained in the yard, falling into the air thick with the stench of mud, trash, and wilted, waterlogged flowers. Guests who had been shuffling out stopped for a moment, a few turning back, their expressions stunned, uncertain. Some lowered their phones not to stop recording, but to hear more clearly, to try to understand where this catastrophe had started. But I didn't flinch. I didn't need a second to respond. I stared straight at her, eyes like drawn blades, unyielding. My voice was cold, stripped of emotion, each word dropping like a stone onto concrete. "No, you destroyed yourself." Karen froze for a split second. Her eyes widened like she'd been struck blind, her face draining pale before flushing crimson, lips trembling as if she'd been exposed in the town square. But a moment later, she screamed even louder, her voice breaking, rising like the desperate howl of someone drowning. "He did this! He's a coward! Disgusting! Ruining our celebration out of spite!" Her screams echoed through the wreckage, isolated and hysterical. The front yard, once her so-called community centerpiece, now looked like a landfill after a storm. White chairs floated in mud, banquet tables lay overturned, tablecloths soaked and filthy, cheap plastic flowers scattered like firecracker remnant. The guests no longer resembled wedding attendees. They looked like evacuees from a disaster. Evening gowns dragged in the dirt, high heels snapped, tailored suits smeared with grime, and every face wore exhaustion, fear, and disbelief. A group of teenagers near the fence chuckled under their breath, filming the chaos before slipping away quietly, as if eager to escape the absurdity. What had once been a joyful day had turned into a farce. Every mocking laugh that had been aimed at me earlier now ricocheted back at the host of this spectacle. I heard a middle-aged man, his hair plastered with sweat, mutter harshly, "Let's go. I'm not getting dragged into this mess." A woman tugged at the hem of her ruined dress, face taut with anxiety, murmuring, "I can't believe she actually planned this." Karen was still there, still screaming, her voice hoarse to the point of incoherence. "He ruined everything. I'll sue. I'll take it all back." She pointed straight at me, her finger trembling, in mud, her eyes burning with rage. But no one was listening anymore. No one believed the lies of a woman unraveling before their eyes. Those who once cheered her, shook her hand, now stood nowhere near her. Dozens of phones continued to record her every move, every flicker of expression, zooming in on every drop of filthy water dripping from the once carefully chosen wedding gown meant to impress. Each moment was being captured not for praise, for ridicule. I didn't say another word. I had said enough. Every sentence I'd spoken had struck at the heart of the matter. Now I simply stood tall, unbowed, unwavering, meeting her gaze with the eyes of someone who had nothing left to fear. I didn't need to shout, didn't need to defend myself. The entire yard had witnessed the truth. They had seen the mask fall, the arrogance crushed by cold, unrelenting reality. The remaining guests trickled away, leaving behind a scene of humiliation. My front yard looked like a battlefield. Wedding flowers were scattered by the wind, torn white ribbons tangled in the fence like strips of ragged cloth. The screech of tires echoed in short bursts through the still afternoon. The murmurs died down to nothing, leaving only the wind and the sound of my own footsteps. Karen collapsed into the mud, the heavy hem of her dress clinging to her leg, her hands trembling as she grasped at the empty air, as if pleading for help. But around her, there was only space. No friends, no allies. Those who once applauded her had turned away. A few neighbors stood by the fence, arms crossed, watching, their faces calm, as if they had waited for this moment all along. They said nothing, offered no applause, but their silence was a verdict. I turned, walking slowly back toward the house. Each step across the wet bricks felt lighter, as if invisible chains inside me were falling away. Karen's screams still echoed, but now they were hollow sound. The cries of someone who had lost everything. No more power, no more control. It was the sound of collapse. I placed my hand on the doorknob, paused for a second, looked back one last time. Karen still sat there, in the wreckage created. The microphone lay broken at her feet, her face streaked dirt, the police standing a few feet away, unmoving. The entire system that once shielded her was no longer functioning. That was the image that would remain in the neighborhood's memory, not as a stain, but as a lesson. I opened the door, and the hinges soft. The door closed behind me, shutting out the screams from outside. I stood inside my house, a house that, finally, had been restored to its rightful meaning of home. Out there, the front yard might be full of mud and debris, but it had been cleansed of falsehood, stripped of imposition, freed from the twisted notion of community rights Karen had fabricated to manipulate. I knew that today, Karen Wellington had lost more than a wedding dress, more than a ceremony. She had lost the armor of power, the respect, and the fear she once instilled throughout the neighborhood. Inside me, a strange calm began to rise. It wasn't the thrill of victory, nor satisfaction, peace light and quiet. I felt no regret, not even a flicker. This had been the only choice to protect my dignity, to defend the land I had poured sweat into to earn. Karen might keep screaming, might sue, might even craft a new narrative, but no one would believe her anymore, because the truth was undeniable. And the truth was this: she had destroyed herself, and I had simply taken back what was mine. The next morning, just as I sat down with a hot cup of coffee, my phone buzzed nonstop. Notifications flooded the screen. Friends, old colleagues, even people I rarely spoke to were sending messages. Curious, I opened them. The screen lit up with a flurry of video links, all with bold, crowded headlines. HOA President's Wedding Destroyed. The clips showed sewage bursting from the ground, plastic chairs floating, Karen Wellington's wedding dress soaked in sludge, and her frantic, broken screams echoing across the yard. Frame by frame, truth was laid bare, and no excuse could save her. Within hours, those videos were everywhere across social media platforms. People shared them like comedy reels, attaching mocking captions. One online news channel wrote, "Big day turns to big disgrace," while another edited a photo of Karen wearing a crown made of trash and mud. The videos were trimmed, synced with funny background music, and the views multiplied by the minute. I scrolled down to the comment sections, my eyes skimming thousands of words pouring in like a flood. One person wrote, "Serves her right. Never seen revenge this satisfying." Another said, "If I were the homeowner, I'd have done the same. No one gets to turn private property into a circus." The praise and support came in waves, like the world had been waiting for someone to rise up and strike back at the fake authority known as the HOA. Some comments shared personal stories, a wave of empathy erupting. "My neighborhood has an HOA too. Our president's just like Karen, constantly handing out ridiculous fines. I wish someone would teach her a lesson like this." Another wrote, "They made me tear down a tiny shed in my yard. Watching this felt like justice." The outpouring was overwhelming, as if Karen Wellington didn't just represent my HOA, but every overreaching HOA across the country. The view count skyrocketed, from a few thousand to tens of thousands, then hundreds of thousands. Every time I hit refresh, the number jumped by tens of thousands more. Social media was in a frenzy. On one major forum, someone posted a long breakdown. "This isn't just a ruined wedding. This is retaliation against the quiet tyranny many residents face daily." The post received thousands of likes. Meanwhile, Karen didn't sit still. I knew she wouldn't. And sure enough, by noon, her personal page featured a long-winded post over 1,000 words. She lamented, accused me of sabotage, painted me as a threat, and even mocked the fact that I had only recently moved in. Her tone was vicious, calling me an outsider with no respect, the one who tore this community apart. But the outcome was the opposite of what she expected. Karen's post instantly became a lightning rod for ridicule. The top comment, pinned by someone else, read, "Can someone please explain to her what private property means?" The next added, "If this was a community event, why was she the only one in a wedding dress? What kind of community sits on plastic chairs floating in sewage?" Then came hundreds of other sarcastic remarks, some even editing screenshots from the video and posting them right under her post. Karen tried to respond to each comment, but the more she fought back, the deeper she sank. People pulled her exact quotes from the video as evidence, especially the moment she raised the microphone and shouted, "This is a perfect example. Immigrants destroying our neighborhood's values." That line no longer echoed just within the block, it echoed across social media, where millions could hear it, and they weren't forgiving. One person wrote, "This isn't about a wedding anymore. It's about bigotry and offense. People like her have no place representing any community." Another added, "When the HOA president spits out nothing but contempt, she shouldn't be surprised when her big day becomes a public farce." Karen's credibility collapsed like a sandcastle hit by wave. With every passing hour, thousands of new comments poured in, most of them mocking. Someone created memes, photoshopping Karen in her mud-stained dress into a satirical cartoon character. Another remixed shrieking voice into a parody soundtrack, syncing it with footage of the sewage explosion. Each piece of satire triggered thousands more shares, fueling her humiliation. By evening, even traditional news had picked up the story. A local station aired a short segment. "Incident at Sycamore neighborhood draws attention to private property rights and HOA conduct." The anchor kept a straight tone, but the accompanying footage showed Karen slipping in the mud, making viewers laugh even during the evening news. Larger outlets began calling the moment a symbol of resistance against HOA overreach. I sat in front of the screen, watching and feeling the weight lift off my shoulders. I didn't need to justify myself or explain anything. The videos had said it all. The online community had become the largest courtroom, and there, Karen Wellington had been found guilty. My phone kept buzzing. Some people called just to say, "I support you. Thank you for doing what we've all wanted to do for years." Others messaged, "You're a hero to every resident bullied by an HOA." I didn't see myself as a hero. I only did what had to be done to protect my home, but the support reminded me I wasn't alone. Karen, on the other hand, was unraveling. I heard from a few neighbors that she'd cried, screamed at her family, accusing someone of betrayal, of leaking the videos, but no one responded. They knew the truth. It wasn't just one person. Dozens had filmed, and they all posted, because they all wanted Karen exposed. I closed the phone screen and leaned back in my chair. The echoes of laughter from the videos still rang faintly in my ear, but I didn't laugh. I felt relief at justice that arrived unexpectedly. I no longer had to shout, no longer had to confront her head on. The truth had found its own way, and the world had watched. Karen's credibility collapsed like a sandcastle, each grain swept away by the tide. Everything she had spent years building vanished overnight. And I knew, from this moment on, the name Karen Wellington would no longer symbolize power in the neighborhood, but would live on as a punchline across social media. I knew the viral video had cracked something open, but it wasn't until the following days that I began to see Karen Wellington's wall of power truly breaking apart piece by piece. That morning, I stepped out to the front yard, the ground now dry after the flood of filthy water had stopped, though still stained with remnants of the failed wedding. On the fence, someone had taped a printout from the internet, photo of Karen falling in the mud, bold letters reading, "Oh, a queen of mud." I didn't know who put it there, but I didn't take it down. Neighbors walking by glanced at it, some with a smirk. It didn't take long for residents to start saying what they had long buried. One afternoon, as I was cleaning up the yard, a middle-aged man named Harold came over. He'd always been quiet, kept to himself. Harold looked around, making sure no one was within earshot, then leaned in and said, "You know, Karen once forced me to let her use my backyard for her grandson's birthday party. I said no, and right after that, I got fined for substandard lawn maintenance. I had to let her do it, just to avoid more penalties." He spoke quickly, voice tight with years of bottled frustration. I looked into his eyes and saw a fire buried deep, and I understood I wasn't the only one whose boundaries had been trampled. Karen had turned trespass into routine. I asked, "Why didn't you say something sooner?" Harold sighed. "We were scared. Around here, if you push back, you get fined or shunned. But now it's different. Everyone saw what she really islanded. I think it's time we speak up." Not long after, more voices emerged. A black family 2 houses down, Marcus and his wife, invited me over for coffee. They opened the door, welcomed me into their living room, and as soon as I sat down, Marcus laid a stack of HOA violation notices on the table. He spoke with quiet restraint. "Did you know we got fined for flying an American flag on our porch?" Meanwhile, the white families who did the same never got so much as a warning. I picked up one of the notices, bold text reading, "Decorative infraction," staring back at me. Marcus gave a bitter smile. "She said the flag was an eyesore, but let's be honest, she just didn't want to see it in front of our house." My son overheard the neighbors talking. He asked me why this happened. The only thing I could say was, "Because we don't fit what she wants to see." Marcus's wife leaned in and added, "We kept quiet to avoid trouble, but when we saw your video, when we heard her say, 'Immigrants destroy the value of this place,' we couldn't stay silent anymore. That's what she thinks of us, and we won't take it anymore." Each story opened like a floodgate. People said Karen once threatened a young family into tearing down a backyard shed for aesthetic disruption, while her friend built a trash truck twice the size without a single warning. A widowed woman shared that Karen made her pay monthly fines because her fence was the wrong color, despite having paperwork proving it was original. These injustices, once scattered whispers, had now become a mountain of testimony. The evidence piled up, undeniable and relentless. A group of residents began organizing, printing out copies of absurd violation notice, emails Karen had sent, and even audio recordings of her yelling. They forwarded everything to local news outlets. Journalists, who had previously only skimmed the story as a viral wedding disaster, now flooded the neighborhood for interviews. I saw cameras pointed at Karen's front gate and heard a reporter ask, "Do you have anything to say about the allegations of discrimination and abuse of power from the residents?" Karen fumbled. First, she shouted denials, but the more she spoke, the more irrational she sounded. A live-streamed video showed her swatting the mic away, refusing to answer, then running back into the house, leaving the reporters chuckling in disbelief. That image went viral, and everyone who saw it knew her mask had fallen off. In the emergency HOA meetings that followed, dozens of residents stood up to speak. An older man with silver hair said flatly, "I've lived here 30 years and never seen anyone turn the HOA into their personal tool like she has. She fined us for not paying into her security fund, but no one knows where that money went." A young woman raised her hand, eyes shining. "We were fined for leaving a moving truck in front of our house for 1 hour, while her son's car sits overnight, and no one says a word. Is that what you call fairness?" Voices followed one after another, peeling back every layer of deceit. I sat at the back of the room, listening, my chest heavy but clear. This was no longer just my story. It was the story of an entire community of people silenced too long. Karen stood at the front, her face stiff, trying to smile, came out twisted. She kept repeating, "This is all a misunderstanding. I only wanted to keep order in the neighborhood." But her voice grew weaker. Every word was cut off by objections, by papers held high. No one was afraid anymore. The image of Karen as the powerful HOA president was gone, replaced by that of a woman exposed, trembling in a sea of evidence. Every insult, every unjust ruling, every act of favoritism was now public record. No one could dismiss it as a small issue. News outlets reported, "Sycamore HOA faces crisis of confidence." Articles detailed the discrimination and abuse, from fining black families for flying flags to coercing residents into lending their yards. Karen was described as figure who exploited the HOA role to manipulate press. Those words weren't mine. They came from journalists and the voices of the people. The whole community watched Karen become a joke. Online, people edited clips of her shouting during meetings, her face flushed, her eyes darting wildly. Someone added the caption, "HOA Queen loses her crown." The video spread almost as fast as the wedding in the mud footage. The HOA's true nature, biased and oppressive, was fully exposed. Recall ballots began circulating, neighbors passing them hand to hand. I saw a resolve in their eyes I had never seen before. They had endured enough. In that moment, I understood the battle was no longer mine alone. Community was rising, and now that the mask had fallen, there would be no way for her to ever hide again. In the days that followed, the news surrounding Karen Wellington no longer revolved solely around the muddy wedding fiasco I had caused, but widened to expose a slew of other secrets. One morning, I opened my inbox to find a link sent from an anonymous email address. The message contained only a single sentence. Take a close look, and you'll understand why so many of us stayed silent for so long. I clicked on the link, and before me appeared a trove of internal HOA documents, clearly leaked from within. PDF files, spreadsheets, notes, each stamped with the HOA seal and the all-too-familiar signature of Karen. I scrolled through the first page and nearly froze. The documents listed homes that had been forcibly sold over the past 7 years, each at prices at least 30% below market value. All followed the same format of notation: non-compliant, repeated violations, recommended for sale, and departure. Within months, each property had been transferred to a vaguely affiliated real estate company, then quickly flipped to friends of Karen or individuals closely tied to the board. I spotted Harold's name, the man who'd told me about being pressured into lending his yard. His old house, according to the records, had been sold for a pittance, then hastily renovated and resold at double the price. It wasn't just Harold. I recognized other names too. The widowed woman who'd been forced to repaint her fence, the young couple who had moved away without a word, even the elderly man who once sighed and told me, "This place isn't meant for everyone." The files didn't stop there. There was a compiled list of petty violations: grass exceeding the height limit by 3 inches, porch lights replaced 2 days late, garage door painted in the wrong shade, and even one fine issued for reversing into a driveway instead of pulling in forward. These infractions filled the pages, fines stacked on top of fines, all engineered to create unbearable pressure until residents felt forced to leave. When I shared the documents with Marcus and a few other neighbors, their shock quickly turned to fury. Marcus slammed his hand on the table, his voice a hiss between clenched teeth. "This isn't management, this is organized theft." His wife broke down crying as she scanned the line item listing all the fines their family had paid, now laid out plainly in a spreadsheet, undeniable proof of the injustice they had endured. The leaked files spread like wildfire. Someone from our group had forwarded everything to the press, and within days, major outlets picked up the story. Sycamore HOA pressured residents to sell homes below market value for profit. Reporters followed the paper trail to the real estate company and discovered its primary owner was Karen's cousin. The entire transaction chain was dissected and exposed, revealing a calculated scheme to strip value from the residents' fear. Neighbors began to recall the scenes they had once witnessed. A silver-haired man spoke up during a meeting. "I still remember the day Karen walked past Mr. Brown's yard, pointed at the patch of weeds, and said in front of everyone, 'If you don't take care of this, I'll fine you until you're forced to move.' A few months later, Mr. Brown's house really did go up for sale, at such a low price I couldn't believe it." Another recalled, "We once heard her threaten an elderly woman that if she didn't pay her dues, she'd be sued and lose her home." A few weeks later, the woman disappeared, and the house was renovated and listed for sale. Story after story piled up, forming a grim picture. Karen was no longer just a domineering figure. She was the head of a manipulative system, turning the HOA into a tool for personal gain. The isolated voices that once drowned in fear had now become a roaring fire. In the neighborhood, people no longer gossiped about me or the act of flooding the lawn. They talked about Karen, about the filth she could no longer hide. From once being the powerful HOA president, she had become the common enemy. No one defended her. Those who used to sit beside her at meetings quietly pulled away, even avoided her altogether. When she walked down the street, instead of polite greetings, she was met with cold stares and whispers of ridicule. The press kept digging. A major newspaper interviewed families who had left the neighborhood, and they recounted in detail how Karen had pressured them. One young couple said, "We kept getting fined for absurd reasons until the debt piled up. We had to sell, and just a few months later, the house changed hands. When we saw the buying company's name tied to Karen, we realized we'd been set up." Each article was another hammer blow to the crumbling wall of Karen's reputation. The entire Sycamore community was shaken. At a small cafe at the end of the street, I sat quietly, listening to neighbors talk. One man exclaimed, "Turns out, we've been living in a nightmare for years without even knowing it." Another added, "No, we knew we were just too afraid. But there's nothing left to be afraid of now." The HOA began to shake. Emergency meetings were held one after another, but no one listened to Karen anymore. She tried to shout over the crowd, denying everything, calling it fake news. But the louder she screamed, the louder the laughter grew. Residents demanded a new board election, demanded a financial audit, and demanded explanations for every murky expense. I sat in one of those meetings, watching Karen stand at the microphone, face flushed red, sweat streaking down her temples. She yelled, "It's all lies. I just wanted to keep this neighborhood in order." But immediately a woman stood up, holding a violation notice high above her head. "Is this your idea of order? You fine me for planting the wrong color flowers, while your house gets to do whatever it wants?" Applause erupted, drowning out Karen's angry protest. Karen turned to the group that had once been her allies, but they were gone. No one sat beside her. No approving glances remained. Everyone had turned away. The castle of power she built on fear had crumbled into dust. I looked at the scene, feeling none of the satisfaction I once imagined. I felt only a simple truth. Anything built on oppression cannot stand. Karen may have held her seat for years, but it took just one day, one burst truth, for it all to vanish faster than sand swept out to sea. When the meeting ended, I stepped outside, the wind cool against my face. I saw neighbors who once stayed silent now stepping forward to shake my hand, their eyes bright. One of them leaned in and said quietly, "You lit the spark, but it's on us to keep fire going. We won't let Karen come back." I nodded. Inside, a heavyweight lift. I knew the fight wasn't over, but the balance had shifted. Karen Wellington had gone from ruler to cornered, from leader to the accused. The truth had exposed everything. And now, all that remained was the final judgment. Have you ever dealt with a nightmare HOA like this? Comment below. I knew Karen Wellington wouldn't stay quiet after her mask was torn off. People like those who thrive on control only know one form of retaliation, dragging others into the pit with them. And just as I expected, a few weeks later, I received a court summons. It clearly stated Karen Wellington, president of the HOA, was suing me for willful disruption of a wedding, causing emotional and material damages to her family. And I held the paper, read it over and over, and a cold smile tugged at my lip. She thought she could flip the board by using the court to turn the victim into the accused. But she forgot everything had been recorded, from the microphone she used to scream in my face to the moment she hurled discriminatory insults in front of hundreds of people. The videos had spread across social media, and now they'd serve as official evidence. I took the summons to my lawyer, a seasoned man familiar with all types of civil cases. After reading the complaint, he smirked, then set the paper down on his desk. "She doesn't stand a chance. This is just a last gasp." I asked if he was sure. He nodded. "Every piece of evidence works against. Besides, the fact that she used your private yard for a wedding without your consent is already grounds for a counterclaim. You're not the defendant, you're the potential plaintiff. Property violation case." That eased my mind a bit, but I stayed cautious. Pulled out the original land use certificate from my safe, still bearing the official red seal, along with the purchase contract from the day I moved in. I had my lawyer make certified copies of everything. Then I sent him dozens of videos taken by neighbors and guests. From the moment Karen declared my yard heart of the community, to her hurling racist insults at me, and finally, to her sinking in the mud as the crowd erupted in laughter. My lawyer watched them and nodded approvingly. I've dealt with a lot of HOA overreach cases. Few are this cut and dried. This is gold. If she dares take this to court, she'll be digging her own grave. No. On the day of the preliminary hearing, the local courthouse was packed. Several reporters showed up. The mud wedding saga was too notorious to ignore. Outside the courthouse, a group held signs, "Stop HOA Abuse. Justice for Homeowners." They weren't from my neighborhood, they came from all over, carrying the fury of those fed up with HOA overreach. Karen arrived wearing a dark dress, trying to regain a sense of dignity, but her eyes darted nervously, her face stiff. As she entered the courtroom, she shot me a quick, hateful glance, but beneath it, I saw fear. The trial began. Karen's lawyer stood and read a lengthy complaint, accusing me of willfully sabotaging the wedding, damaging the family's reputation, and causing tens of thousands of dollars in loss. He spoke with forced conviction, hammering the phrase emotional harm over and over. Karen sat beside him, nodding solemnly, fake tears welling in her eyes. When it was our turn, my lawyer stood up and calmly presented a file. He began, "Before we even discuss sabotage, we must first establish where this wedding was held." He held up the land deed, his voice firm and clear. "This is a legal document proving the defendant is the rightful owner of the property where the ceremony took place. Without his consent, holding a wedding there constitutes trespassing." The courtroom stirred. The judge struck the gavel, calling for order. My lawyer continued, unshaken, and played the video of Karen holding a microphone, declaring, "Welcome, everyone, this is the heart of the community." Then came my voice, ringing out, "This is my house. This is my land." Courtroom fell silent. What needed proving was already undeniable. Karen looked flustered, her face flushed red, trying to interject. It was just a metaphor. I meant the community spirit. But her voice trailed off, drowned by the audience's murmurs and mocking whisper. My lawyer wasn't finished. He played the next Karen shouting, "This is a prime example. Immigrants destroying the values of this neighborhood." Her words echoed like a blade slicing through the air, leaving the courtroom stunned. Some shook their heads in disbelief, and a few reporters scribbled frantically. My lawyer concluded plainly, this was not a defense of community. This was blatant discrimination, a direct and serious insult to the defendant. The one who caused reputational harm wasn't him, it was Mrs. Wellington. I looked at Karen, she had gone pale. Desperate, her eyes wild, she screamed out in the middle of the court, "I'm the victim. My daughter's wedding was ruined. My family's honor dragged through the mud." The judge struck the gavel again, voice stern. "Order. This is a courtroom, not a place where emotion overrides evidence." The plaintiff fell completely silent. Their attorney had nothing left to argue, only stammered something about emotional damages. But everyone could see clearly, Karen's lawsuit was nothing more than a desperate attempt. The trial wasn't over, but public opinion had already shifted. Reporters spilled into the hallway, live streaming everything. People saw Karen leave the courtroom, courtroom, face twist, trying to cover herself while shouting, "I won't give up, I'll sue to the end." But her words sounded like the last cries of someone who had lost everything. I walked out behind, not with my head held high, not triumphant. I knew this was only one step in a longer road, but I also knew Karen Wellington no longer had control. No matter how much she clung to it, no matter how many lawsuits she filed, people had already seen the truth, and that truth could not be erased. Karen kept trying to hold on, and that was understandable. She had grown used to power, to mistaking other people's silence for agreement. But the mask had come off, and the evidence was overwhelming. Every move she made now only made her look more like a public spectacle. I went home, placed the land deed on the table, and looked at it for a long time. I thought about everything that had happened, about those early days when I first moved, thinking I only needed peace. Then I thought of Karen trampling over boundaries, turning the whole neighborhood into something she could manipulate. But now, the wheel had turned. She might still be screaming, but no one was truly listening. That night, I sat on the porch, watching neighbors walk by, seeing their smiles, some raising a hand in greeting. In their eyes, I was no longer the outsider, no longer alone. They looked at me like someone who had opened a door for them. And I knew, no matter how long Karen kept fighting, this community had changed for good. The day of the final trial arrived, and the atmosphere outside the local courthouse was unlike any other. Crowds gathered on the steps, porters, residents of Sycamore, and strangers who didn't know me but had followed the story online. Signs appeared again, this time with bolder words. "Stop hoe abuse, justice for homeowners, no more Karen power." I stepped through the doors, feeling dozens of eyes on me, not with suspicion, but silent support. Karen Wellington was there too, stiff and uneasy. She wore a dark coat, face layered in makeup to mask the exhaustion, but no amount of foundation could hide the panic in her eye. In her arms, clutched a stack of documents like a drowning person gripping a straw. Walking beside her was her private attorney, but he moved slowly, his face heavy, clearly not expecting a victory. As we took our seats as defendant and plaintiff, I looked behind me and saw neighbors, those who once stayed silent, now sitting quietly in solidarity. I caught Marcus's eye, the black man who had told me about being fined for hanging the flag, and he nodded firmly. Harold was there too, aged, clear-eyed. I knew then I was no longer alone. The trial began. The judge, a silver-haired man with a stern voice, read the case summary. Karen Wellington accused me of sabotaging the wedding, seeking damages for emotional and material harm. But my lawyer and I had filed a counterclaim, clearly proving trespass. Videos, property documents, and witness statements were all submitted in full. Karen's lawyer spoke first, his voice strained. "Your Honor, this was a sacred day for my client's family. The defendant's actions caused severe emotional distress and public humiliation. Furthermore, numerous wedding items were damaged, with losses totaling tens of thousands of dollars." He read each line, but his tone lacked conviction, his eyes avoiding the back of the courtroom where cameras were rolling live. Then it was my attorney's turn. He stood, his tone calm but resolute. "Your Honor, first and most important fact to establish is this: the wedding took place in the defendant's front yard. This is legally owned property, with certified documentation. The plaintiff's act of unilaterally using it for an event without any form of consent constitutes trespass." Videos from that day clearly show the defendant repeatedly objecting and asking for the event to stop, only to be ignored, insulted, publicly demeaned. If anyone suffered emotional damage, it was the defendant and his family, and it was caused directly by the plaintiff. Then he played the video. The courtroom fell completely silent, with only the speaker playing Karen's voice shouting into the microphone. "This is a prime example, immigrants ruining the value of this neighborhood." Her voice echoed through the chamber, causing many to frown. The judge furrowed his brow, tapped his gavel lightly to restore order, then stared directly at Karen with a weighted gaze. My attorney concluded by holding up the file. "We respectfully request that the court dismiss the entire lawsuit, declare the defendant not liable, and further consider the plaintiff's responsibility for causing both material and emotional damage to the homeowner." Karen shot to her feet, shrieking, "He destroyed my daughter's wedding. That's the truth. He drowned us in mud and turned my whole family into a joke." Her voice cracked, her face flushed, her hands trembling violently. The judge banged the gavel hard. "Order, Mrs. Wellington, sit down. This court will render judgment based on evidence, not emotion." The room held its breath. I sat upright, hands clasped, feeling each second drag like a weight. Then finally, the judge spoke, his voice firm and clear. "After reviewing all submitted evidence, including legal land documents, recorded video of the event, and witness testimony, this court finds the defendant not liable. The plaintiff's lawsuit is hereby dismissed." A wave of murmurs swept through the courtroom. I heard a soft exhale behind me, quiet clapping of a few neighbors. The judge continued, "Furthermore, plaintiff, Mrs. Karen Wellington, is ordered to pay for all repair and restoration costs to the defendant's property, as well as cover all legal fees incurred. The court also notes that the plaintiff's conduct has caused significant harm to the reputation of the HOA, a matter that warrants further review by upper management. That final line landed like a hammer. Karen staggered, her face pale. She looked as if she was about to object, but her attorney tugged her sleeve and shook his head. He knew it was over. I sat still, listening to the final bang of the gavel. Court is adjourned. The weight lifted off my chest, like a boulder pulled away. I didn't cheer, didn't raise my fist, just breathed in, slow and deep. Justice had spoken clearly and unequivocally. Karen was a different story. She rose like a walking corpse, eyes vacant, lips quivering without a word. People stepped aside as she passed, avoiding that fierce but hollow stare. Reporters raised their cameras, flashes firing in bursts, capturing the image of a woman who had once ruled with arrogance, now utterly defeated. No one greeted her. No one offered a pat on the back. She drifted through the crowd, lost, then disappeared behind the courthouse doors. I stepped outside, and neighbors came forward, shaking hands, smiling. Marcus leaned in and said quietly, "You didn't just win for yourself, you won for all of us." Harold nodded, his eyes lit with a long overdue sense of joy. I gripped their hands firmly, feeling the warmth pass through, knowing this was a victory for the entire community. The wedding that Karen once saw as the peak of her power had now become the very evidence used against her. Every video clip, every image of that mud-stained dress, every scream laced with prejudice had turned into nails sealing the coffin of her credibility. There was no going back, no room for redemption. The court had ruled, and public opinion had spoken. On the drive home, I looked out the car window and saw the Sycamore neighborhood bathed in quiet afternoon sunlight. The houses still stood, the fences still lined up perfectly, but I knew something had shifted. The residents would no longer look at the HOA with fear, and certainly never again bow to Karen. That evening, I sat alone on the porch, sipping coffee, thinking about all that had happened. I remembered Karen boldly setting up the wedding art, her voice spitting out words of division, her body flailing in the mud. Now, all of it was in the past. My retaliation hadn't just reclaimed my land, it had tipped the entire balance of power. Karen Wellington had left the courthouse like a walking corpse, and I knew from now on, her name would no longer be spoken with fear, but with biting laughter. Justice had spoken not just for me, for every resident who had ever suffered under the weight of an abusive HOA. Just days after the trial, the Sycamore neighborhood was no longer the same. Residents whispered in passing, small gatherings formed on porches, cafes, even in shared courtyards. Everyone talked about one thing: Karen Wellington could no longer remain president of the HOA. After everything that had come to light, from the mud wedding to the leaked documents, from the failed case to the recorded slurs, there was a unanimous understanding. Karen's time was over. An emergency meeting was called at the community center. That evening, the room was packed, chairs crammed tight, many people left standing along the walls. The air was taut like a stretched wire, not with fear as before, but with determination. An elderly resident stood first, voice trembling but firm. "We cannot allow someone like this to represent us any longer. Tonight, I propose we vote to remove Karen Wellington from her position as HOA president." His words echoed, and the room stirred. Marcus stood next, eyes blazing. "I was fined for flying a flag, while others weren't. I'll never forget it. It's time we reclaim fairness." Voices rose in agreement, reverberating throughout the room. Karen sat in the front row, face pale. She tried to rise and respond, but before she could speak, a young woman raised an old violation notice and shouted, "What do you have to say, when so many families here suffered under your ridiculous rules?" Applause erupted, drowning out Karen's voice. She had no choice but to sit back down, face contorted in fury. The vote was held openly, and each resident was handed a ballot. No one looked away, no one acted in secret. People signed with a new sense of purpose, with a relief felt like a burden lifted. When the results were announced, the room exploded. An overwhelming majority voted for removal. Karen, who once ruled through fear, was officially stripped of her position right in front of her neighbor. I watched it unfold, a strange feeling rising in my chest. It wasn't satisfaction, it was release. The community had chosen to end the abuse of power. I saw Harold grip his wife's hand, their eyes glistening, and Marcus smile, a smile I had never seen from him before. But the moment didn't end there. Those who had once sided with Karen, who had backed her in meetings, now slipped away. They left the room quickly, avoiding the gaze of neighbors. A man who used to throw his arm around Karen's shoulders now stared at the floor, hastily packing his papers before disappearing. No one said a word, but the silence exposed their opportunism. Karen still sat there, eyes bloodshot, both hands clenching the arms of her chair. She looked ready to scream, but no one cared to listen anymore. Her credibility was in ruin, her allies gone, and all that remained was a solitary figure. I knew this moment marked an irreparable crack. The Sycamore HOA had fractured, and from now on, no one would ever fear the name Karen Wellington again. After the vote to remove Karen Wellington, the aftermath rippled through Sycamore like a shockwave. No one had expected the seemingly unshakable reign of power she held to collapse so quickly, but once trust is broken, nothing can hold it together. The next day, the HOA board, now just a shadow of Karen, called another emergency meeting, but the community room that was once packed was now nearly empty. Those who once sat proudly in the front rows, hands raised in agreement with her every decree, no longer showed up. More residents gathered outside than inside, openly saying the HOA no longer had a reason to exist. An elderly resident stood and spoke with a voice that echoed, "For years, we've paid monthly fees to a system that only knows how to punish. Karen is gone, then so is the HOA's purpose. We need to dismantle it all and start fresh." Applause erupted, louder than at any meeting before. A few days later, the official decision was posted. The Sycamore HOA was dissolved. The notice appeared on the neighborhood bulletin board with a clear line. As of today, the Sycamore HOA is no longer in effect. People read it, smiled, then took photos and sent them around as proof of victory. The atmosphere in the neighborhood changed unmistakably. Neighbors started talking more, doors opened wider, and laughter echoed along the sidewalk. Fear once tied to the name HOA vanished. Harold exhaled when he recalled the absurd fines he had paid. Marcus smiled as he rehung the American flag on his porch without worrying anyone would knock. Still, the residents didn't want to leave the community unorganized. After much discussion, they agreed to form a new group, smaller, transparent. It wasn't called an HOA anymore, but the Sycamore Residents Committee. At the first meeting, everyone had a voice. Minutes were written and posted for all to read. No more one-person rule, no more fear of power being used for gain. A young woman stood up and said proudly, "We don't need anyone making up ridiculous rules. All we need is mutual respect." Her words were met with unanimous agreement. People signed up to join, and tasks were divided into groups from landscaping to planning community events. Everything ran on goodwill, not force. I sat in the back of the room, quietly observing. In that moment, I saw the neighborhood truly transform. The same faces that once bowed to Karen now stood tall, eyes shining. Transparency had breathed new life into the place. And more importantly, the residents understood they could decide for themselves without relying on fake authority. Karen Wellington vanished from the life of the neighborhood. Her big house stayed shut, curtains drawn all day, no visitors coming or going. No one remembered her as a leader anymore, only as the one who dragged the HOA into the ground. On the day the new committee officially launched, a sign was put up: Sycamore Residents Committee, transparent, fair. It wasn't a flashy sign, just a small wooden board hanging in front of the community room, but its meaning ran deep. It marked the end of a dark era and the beginning of a new chapter where people lived equally and respected each other's boundaries. I stepped out of that meeting, walked down the sunlit street, heard the sound of children playing, dogs barking brightly, and felt a weight lift from my chest. The HOA was officially dissolved, and a new committee had risen, as clear and open as the sky above. The collapse of the Sycamore HOA wasn't just the end of Karen Wellington's power, it marked the final chapter of her story. After being unanimously voted out by the residents, after the court ruled in my favor and ordered her to pay for the lawn repairs, Karen had nothing left to cling to. The allies who once applauded her every word had disappeared, none daring to publicly stand with her. The grand house she once treated as a fortress of authority turned into a place of isolation, its doors locked, curtains drawn all day. But avoidance couldn't last. A month later, word spread across the neighborhood. Karen was being forced to sell her house. Some said she was drowning in legal fees. Others claimed her reputation was so thoroughly destroyed, she couldn't bear to stay. Whatever the reason, the outcome was clear. The woman who once ruled the HOA, who once called me an outsider, now had to leave in disgrace. On the day Karen moved out, I stood quietly on my porch, watching. A moving truck arrived, workers carrying out boxes from the house that had once hosted endless HOA meetings. Karen appeared at the door, pride gone from her posture. She kept her head down, wore a wide-brimmed hat that hid half her face, clutched a small box in trembling hands. No microphone, no voice booming across the block, only a frail, worn figure. Neighbors stood scattered along the street. No one shouted, no one offered pity. They watched, marking the moment in memory. Someone murmured, "That's the price of arrogance." Another shook their head. "She hurt too many people. It's finally over." Those words drifted through the silence, no chance needed. They stood as judgment on their own. Karen stepped off the porch, her heels sinking slightly into the lawn she once demanded, trimmed to regulation inch by inch. She didn't look at anyone, didn't raise her face. That lowered head was proof she had lost completely. For Karen, the silence of the crowd was more terrifying than any shouting ever could be. Before the truck pulled away, a boy from the neighborhood held up his phone, chuckling, and showed me the screen. It was the viral meme of Karen in her mud-streaked wedding dress, sprawled across the lawn. The caption, "Queen of Mud." That photo had become the symbol of a tyrant's downfall. It circulated online, stored in residents' phones, a lasting reminder that arrogance will always be exposed. The truck drove off, its tires marking the pavement, leaving behind only the image of Karen sitting inside, her face half lit, head bowed like she was fleeing the gaze of the entire neighborhood. On the day she left Sycamore, no one waved goodbye, no one wished her well. Only a collective silence remained heavy as a final verdict. I stood there, exhaling a long breath. There was no gloating in my chest, only relief. A dark era had ended. Karen Wellington would never return. I stood on my porch, arms folded, eyes following the slow-moving truck as it rolled out of Sycamore. Karen Wellington sat inside, silent like a fading shadow. She didn't lift her head, didn't look back. All the arrogance she once wore crushed to dust without a trace. The curtain inside the truck window hung slightly open, but I could still picture her pale face, eyes avoiding everything. The road she traveled today was the same one she used to walk, with the weight of authority in every step. Each house on either side had once been subject to her rules, her petty fines. Now, those very homes bore witness to her disgrace. Every whisper, every cold glance was like a blade slicing into the self-righteous armor Karen had once flaunted. As the truck neared the neighborhood gate, something unexpected happened. A crowd of residents standing on both sides of the street began to applaud. First, just a claps, scattered and hesitant, then growing louder, swelling into a thunderous ovation. It wasn't applause for someone respected, it was a farewell to someone who had spread fear and injustice. The sound echoed through the neighborhood, mingling with looks of satisfaction and long-awaited peace. I looked around and saw Marcus clapping hard, a bright smile lighting up his face. Harold clapped too, eyes glistening, as if he'd finally shaken off the weight of years lived in shadow. Children ran and laughed, too young to understand it all, but still feeling the lift in the air. Those who had once stayed silent, once bowed to the HOA, now stood together in a shared chorus of liberation. I didn't join the applause right away, I just stood there, letting the moment carve itself into memory. That sound wasn't for me, it was for the truth, for justice reclaimed. It was also the final nail in the coffin of Karen Wellington's reign of deceit. When the clapping reached its peak, I gave a small nod, a silent farewell to the figure that had vanished beyond the gate. Inside me, there was no more anger, no lingering hatred, just a profound lightness. Karen had left, taking all her pride with her, leaving behind a neighborhood free to breathe again. From here, Sycamore would write a new chapter, one without abuse of power, without voices yelling down from pedestals. The truck disappeared at the end of the road, the applause faded, replaced by a strange quiet, not the silence of fear, but the stillness of something beginning. I stepped down from my porch and joined the crowd, and in every eye I met, I saw a unity we had never shared before. Karen was gone, and we had won not with power, but with truth and resolve. If you saw it with your own eyes, would you laugh in satisfaction, or walk away with a lesson? In the days after Karen Wellington left Sycamore, the atmosphere changed noticeably. The street that once felt heavy every time she passed now seemed bright, quiet, and clear. I stood in the middle of my yard, the same place that had once been a mud-soaked wedding hall, now scattered only with wilted fake flowers and patches of discolored soil. Looking at the scene, I knew it was time to start over, not just for the yard, but for the spirit of my family. My wife, daughter, and I spent the entire weekend restoring it. We cleared out every piece of debris, pulled up the leftover fake flower stems, and carefully spread new soil. My daughter dug holes with both hands, her small fingers covered in dirt, but her eyes shining with joy. I chose hardy, colorful flowers, ones that would bloom bright and wide, turning the trampled ground into a vibrant garden. My wife arranged pots and planters, saying this place that once symbolized humiliation would now stand for hope. As we worked, a few neighbors came by. First was Harold, the elderly man who had endured so much under Karen's rule. He walked over and grasped my hand tightly. In a raspy voice, he whispered, "Thank you. Because of you, finally dared to stand tall." I just smiled, knowing what I had done was never just for myself. Then Marcus and his family arrived. He grinned, his eyes filled with emotion. "You're planting flowers, I brought a few more. Let's call it a new beginning." His wife placed several pots of sunflowers on the table, saying these flowers always turn toward the light, and so should our neighborhood. Together, we dug and planted, each flower quiet promise. More people followed. Some brought tools, others brought paint to help repaint my fence. No one spoke about the past. No one mentioned Karen. Everyone simply focused on rebuilding something new. Laughter rang out. Conversations flowed easily, nothing like the stiff, tense air of past HOA meeting. I looked around and saw neighbors shaking hands, adults chatting, and kids running freely. The road once divided by control was now joined by connection. I could feel it, this community was coming alive again. It no longer ran on fear and pressure, but on trust and respect. As the sun set, the garden in front of our home had taken shape. The small flower beds nestled together, still fragrant with fresh earth, but I knew they would soon bloom fully. I stood silently for a moment, watching my family and neighbors around me, then smiled. Karen was gone, and with her departure, Sycamore had turned the page. We were no longer a community ruled by a name, but one rebuilt by the hands and hearts of people who truly wanted to live together. In the days following Karen Wellington's departure, Sycamore felt like it had put on a new coat. The road that used to carry such a heavy air now felt open, brighter, and more peaceful. No more fine notices stuck quietly to doors, no more cautious glances when someone stepped outside. People started talking more, and laughter returned to the front porches that had long stood silent. I walked down the street in the morning and saw small flags hanging once again on front porches, fluttering in the wind. In the past, flag was an excuse for the HOA to cause trouble. Now, it's a symbol of freedom. Families who once bowed their heads now confidently repair their fences, plant flowers in their front yards, and open their garage doors without worrying someone will jot it down. With the HOA's shadow gone, everyone is free to live in their own way. Marcus told me that in the evenings, he can sit on his porch steps and play guitar for his children without fearing Karen would call it disturbing the peace. Harold has started replanting his vegetable garden in the back, something he had abandoned long ago, out of fear. It didn't meet aesthetic standards. An elderly woman in the neighborhood burst into tears when her neighbors helped her repaint her fence, and for the first time, no warning notice showed up in her mailbox. All those simple things, once labeled as violations, now stand as proof of a life that's ordinary but deeply valuable. The atmosphere in the neighborhood is entirely different now, lighter, as if a long-standing layer of dust had finally been wiped clean. Each morning, I hear children laughing on the sidewalk, the sound of bicycle wheels turning, greetings exchanged instead of hurried footsteps avoiding one another. People who were once strangers now shake hands, share seeds, and invite each other for a cup of tea. I realized this change didn't come from any one decision. It came from a collective awakening. They understood that only when fear is removed can a true community take shape. I stood in my yard, watching the newly planted garden begin to sprout pale green leaves, felt a quiet sense of faith inside. No one is burdened by absurd regulations anymore, and no one anxiously waits for the next fine notice. The neighborhood has returned to what it's supposed to be, a place where people live alongside each other, not one where a single person imposes their will on everyone else. And that very sense of relief is what makes every day in Sycamore feel like the beginning of something new. In the days when Sycamore returned to peace, soft sunlight spread across rooftops, the grass in the yard no longer trampled by unfamiliar feet, and the sound of hammers driving fake floral arches had faded into the past like a passing nightmare. I realized something important. The downfall of Karen Wellington didn't come solely from my counterattack. From the moment the entire community stood up together. It wasn't a fatal blow from one person, but a domino effect set off when people began to speak. When the residents, those who had once lived with their heads down, avoiding her gaze, started sharing stories of being oppressed, when shady emails, questionable fines, and baseless decisions were brought into the light, the truth was no longer the property of one person, no longer twisted in HOA meetings orchestrated by her. It was returned to its rightful owner, the community. I saw a simple truth, one that many often forget. Silence in the face of injustice only feeds the monster. Karen Wellington grew stronger because of that silence, that avoidance, that seemingly harmless submission. Every averted gaze, every reluctant nod, every whispered complaint behind closed doors was a brick in the throne she built. But when that wall began to crack not through violence, through truth and unity, it crumbled beneath the sound of awakening. At the first meeting of the new resident committee, held in the community hall instead of Karen's house as it had been before, no one needed to say much about the past, but everyone silently understood that what had happened was a hard-earned lesson never to be repeated. There was no tension or infighting, no suspicious glances or sarcastic tones, just ordinary people sitting together, truly equal for the first time. Marcus, the quiet man from the corner house, stood up to speak, his voice steady as if he had waited a long time for this moment. We must be transparent, because only transparency can stop the seeds of oppression. We must respect each family's boundaries, because that respect is what holds us together. The entire room nodded. There was no loud applause like in the days when Karen tried to manipulate the mood, only a quiet, genuine consensus. I looked around the room, seeing each face. Some I had seen bow their heads in fear when passing Karen's house. Others who once avoided me for fear of association. Now they were looking each other in the eye, no longer wary, no longer evasive. Harold, the frail old man from across the street, the one I had seen fall into a chilling silence whenever Karen asserted power, raised his hand. His voice was slow but firm, each word carved from the heart. I've lived here for 30 years. I used to think silence meant safe, but I was wrong. True safety only exists when we protect justice together. That statement left many people in stunned silence, few wiping their eyes. Not because Harold spoke loudly, but because he dared to speak at all, and that courage was contagious. Since that meeting, the entire Sycamore community seemed to step into a new chapter. The bulletin boards were rebuilt clear, transparent. Every decision, no matter how small, was documented and made public. No more closed-door meetings, no more vague regulations voted on internally by a small minority. Every expense and revenue was reported to all residents. But most important, and I believe more important than money, was the commitment to respecting each family's personal boundary. No one dared step onto another's yard without knock. No one dared invoke common good to justify imposition. I felt truly at ease seeing neighbors shaking hands not out of obligation and nodding without the usual hesitation. Stories that had long been silenced by Karen were finally told not to reopen old wounds, but to remind everyone that silence is never the right choice. Each person understood that if another injustice were to appear, no matter how small, no matter who it came from, they would not wait for it to become a storm, but would stop it when it was still just a spark. That evening, as the air turned cool, I sat on my porch, looking at my little garden. The flowers I planted had started blooming again, not the cheap plastic ones Karen once hung, but real blossom, with soft petals, gentle fragrance, and bees and butterflies fluttering around. A light breeze carried the scent of fresh grass, and the smell of earth after the first fall rain. Children's laughter echoed from down the street, pure, carefree. I no longer felt like a newcomer, no longer like the outsider Karen once declared me to be. I was part of a community that had awakened, and I knew Sycamore would never return to what it was. The lesson Sycamore received wasn't just meant to be remembered, but to be lived by every day. Never let fear be used as a tool. Never let silence nourish oppression. Never let another Karen Wellington rise from the neglect of the collective. In the conversations that followed the official dissolution of the Sycamore HOA, a conclusion no one mourned, everyone shared the same understanding. Justice may arrive late, but when it comes, it has the weight crush all that's rotten. Many once believed the truth would be buried forever, beneath layers of meetings, documents, and propaganda flyers. They thought personal frustration was just a ripple, never strong enough to topple a machine. But then each piece was turned over, each word verified, each seemingly isolated story connected to form an undeniable. Karen Wellington thought she could hide forever behind titles and booming speeches, but it was her own arrogance, her unchecked pride, that turned her into living proof of failure. I heard Harold say he once lost sleep over absurd violation notices taped to his door, just for planting the wrong color flower. I thought I'd die carrying this injustice with me, he said, but I got to see the day it collapsed. Marcus shared with me one cool afternoon, as the two of us watered our front yard. I told my son that justice can be slow, but if you stay steady, it will come, and you'll be the one to witness it. Those words echoed in my mind, longer than I expected, because they weren't just about a small fight in a neighborhood, they were about a larger principle in life. Patience and courage are never meaningless. I realized no one looked back on the past with fear anymore. No longer did Karen's shadow hang over meetings. No longer did people glance around the room with wary eyes. What remained was a community that had learned how to protect each other, a place where truth was respected, where everyone understood that if they spoke up at the right moment, they could shake even the most rigid of systems. Truth might be delayed, but it is never denied. And when it arrives, it never comes alone. It brings light, it brings justice, and it brings back faith. I came home to find my daughter sitting on the step. She was playing with a few fallen roses from the bush, her eyes bright, no longer carrying the unease that once haunted her in our early days here. She looked up and asked me, her voice small but full of trust, "Dad, it's all over now, right?" I nodded, and in that moment, I knew it wasn't just Karen Wellington who had fallen. A piece of my child's stolen childhood, once overshadowed by heavy-handed control, finally been returned. That piece, no one would ever take it from her again. As I held her in my arms, I knew everything I had done wasn't just to reclaim a yard. It was to protect my daughter's right to grow up unburdened by fear. And to me, that was the greatest, not over Karen, but over the darkness she once embodied. One early morning, just as the sun crept over the trees, I stood in my yard, once the battleground of humiliation and defiance. The newly planted flowers had begun to sprout, their green leaves pushing through the brown soil, quiet proof of rebirth. I bent down, gently touching a tender stem, a feeling I couldn't name rising in my chest. The yard that had been turned into a stage for mockery was now a place where my family and I placed our hope. I looked up at the open sky, listening to birds chirping brightly, and laughed as the memories came rushing back. I remembered the moment the dirty water burst forth, sweeping away the glamorous wedding Karen Wellington had imposed. The mud-stained dress, the screaming, the chaos, it now felt like a play that had ended its final act. I didn't laugh out of spite, but from the realization that justice sometimes arrives in the most unexpected form, raw, fierce, precise. My daughter ran out, holding her notebook, and whispered, "Dad, our flowers are so pretty." I smiled, lifted her up, and pointed to the growing trees. Her eyes sparkled, free of the fear that once clouded them, and I knew I had done the most important thing, made sure she could grow up in peace, not under the shadow of power. Neighbors began to stop by, each with a story, a smile. They looked at the flowers, then shook my hand firmly. From now on, we would no longer be divided by fear, but united by respect. Karen Wellington was gone. The HOA had crumbled, and what remained was more than just a memory of injustice. It was a reminder that a community is strongest when it dares to say no to oppression. I walked back into the house, a weight lifted from my chest. Sycamore had entered a new chapter, and I believed we would preserve this peace. The young plants would grow tall, offering shade for generations. And whenever I remembered that surge of dirty water, I would laugh, seeing it as a strange but rightful milestone, closing the age of arrogance and opening one of unity. I stood still in the yard, watching the young shoots stretch toward the morning Sunday. The soil was still fresh, damp, fragrant with spring, as if this very ground had been liberated alongside me. Each green leaf was a quiet reminder that a place once trampled, once turned into a farce, had returned to its true meaning: private space, where my family built happiness and trust. In that moment, one thought rang clear: no one has the right to turn my home into a stage. Karen Wellington's word, her voice blaring through the microphone, the rows of white chairs shamelessly set across my yard. It all felt like yesterday, but I wasn't angry anymore. What remained was the clarity of someone who had walked full path and understood personal boundaries are the foundation of freedom. Anyone who violates that, whether under the banner of community or power, deserves the consequences. I know that if I had stayed silent that day, if I had accepted the wedding taking place on my own front yard, I wouldn't be standing here now with this sense of pride. Silence is never a solution, it only empowers the oppressor. I chose a different path. I struck back, hard. That twist of the valve didn't just unleash a stream of dirty water. It released all the built-up resentment, the humiliation, the days of being looked down on. Sometimes, justice can't arrive gently. Sometimes, it has to come roaring in so that those who create injustice never forget. I let out a quiet laugh, remembering Karen stumbling across the yard, her wedding dress turned into a rag, the crowd's mocking laughter echoing. That image, no matter how many memes it inspired, remains to me a milestone of truth. The arrogant fell right into the mud they once scorned. It wasn't just retaliation, it was a public lesson for the entire community that arrogance always gets crushed when it tries to cross human boundaries. The whole of Sycamore has changed. Harold can plant his vegetable garden again. Marcus can hang his flag without fearing a knock at the door. Children can laugh and play outside without being accused of disturbing the peace. These small, simple things that should have always been normal, now feel like victory. I look around and see homes lit with a new sense of trust. Neighbors no longer avoiding each other but ready to shake hands. It reminds me that justice, though it may come late, always sweeps clean. My daughter runs out, her eyes clear as glass. She sits beside the newly planted flower bed, gently cradling the small blossoms, then looks up and asks, "Daddy, we're safe now, right?" I stroke her head, look into her peaceful eyes, and nod. I know the days of fear are behind us. She'll grow up in a neighborhood no longer haunted by the HOA, and in her memory, justice won't be some distant concept, it will be real. As the sky begins to darken, I stand up and take a deep breath, letting the scent of soil and flowers fill my lungs. I understand that this story isn't just mine. It belongs to everyone who's ever been suppressed, disrespected, or forced into silence. I want each person who hears it to remember: sometimes, justice has to be fierce, not for revenge, but to restore balance. I step back into the house, gently closing the door behind me, feeling light. The yard is back to what it was meant to be. My family has found peace, and for me, that is enough. Standing before the freshly planted garden, I know I'm not just witnessing the rebirth of a piece of land, but the profound transformation of the entire Sycamore community. The young shoots pushing through the soil once trampled make me think of everything we've endured, from the first moment I saw my yard turned into a wedding stage to the day Karen Wellington walked away, head bowed in icy silence. This story isn't just a string of personal conflict. It's the journey of a community reclaiming its voice. I remember the first feeling I had when I was pushed outside the boundaries of the land I rightfully owned. A banner, a few rows of chairs, Karen's declarations, all of it felt like a slap to my dignity. Confronted with such abuse of power, I had no choice but to stand up. But the deeper I stepped into the conflict, the clearer it became that this wasn't just about me. Every family in this neighborhood had been subjected to Karen's overreach in some form. They had just stayed silent to avoid trouble. The days that followed proved that silence only lets monsters grow. Karen gradually turned the HOA into her personal tool, punishing the vulnerable, favoring the well-connected, and even using a wedding to flaunt her power. She thought fear alone could keep people in line, but it was the moment she declared my yard the heart of the community that she pushed the entire neighborhood to its breaking point. When I turned the valve and let the filthy water burst out, it wasn't just retaliation, it was an alarm bell. It exposed the absurdity, tore the mask off her so-called authority, and more surprisingly, it sparked courage in neighbors who had long seemed resigned to silence. They began to speak up, to denounce the injustices they'd endured, to share stories they'd buried. It turned out, Karen had sown fear for too long, but it was that very fear that made people yearn desperately to be free from it once and for all. I won't deny that my actions were harsh, but sometimes, justice needs to be harsh in order to make itself heard. If it had stopped at polite objections, nothing would have changed. The force of that dirty water, the public disgrace Karen faced, that was the turning point that forced the community to choose: continue living under oppression, come together and rewrite the rules. They chose the latter. What stays with me most isn't the image of Karen stumbling out of court like a walking corpse, but the quiet changes that came after. Flag raised without a citation, a backyard garden brought back to life, the sound of children playing freely in the street without anyone knocking to complain. All these simple things, once labeled violations, are now symbols of the freedom the residents reclaimed. The greatest lesson lesson we've learned here is that justice may arrive late, but when it comes, it's certain, and it leaves no one untouched. The years under Karen's manipulation weren't wasted, because they taught this community the value of transparency and respect. They understood that, to prevent history from repeating, there must be a shared commitment, every decision must be public, and every personal boundary must be honored. From that formed a new committee, not burdened by the old HOA name, but a transparent residents' council, built on unity. To me, the lesson carried an added layer of meaning. I saw peace return in my daughter's eyes. She had witnessed her father being humiliated, had once trembled at the sound of hateful screams, but now she could sit by the flower garden, smiling without fear that someone might step into our yard tomorrow, barking orders. Justice, for me, was not just about defeating Karen, it was a gift to the next generation, so they could grow up in freedom. This story might make some people laugh at its ironic absurdity, but beneath that laughter lies a stern reminder. Every community, every neighborhood, every collective can harbor its own Karen, someone willing to abuse power to dominate others. If everyone stays silent, that person grows stronger and turns that silence into a weapon. But if even one person dares to step forward, dares to do what's right, then the whole community can be set free. I believe the flowers in my yard today aren't just for my family, they're for every resident of Sycamore. They remind us justice sometimes arrives in strange forms, perhaps with bitter laughter, perhaps through a bold act, but it always comes when people stay true. And most importantly, it leaves behind lasting peace, kind every piece of land, every family truly deserves. If someone were to ask me, I'd say, the greatest lesson wasn't in the filthy splash of retaliation, but in the moment the entire community chose to stand together. No single cheer could have changed anything, but when an entire neighborhood finds its voice, even the most arrogant figure must bow. And that is justice in its simplest form. Truth acknowledged, boundaries respected, and people allowed to live with dignity. I looked at the garden one more time, took a deep breath, and smiled. The memories of that surge of dirty water still lingered, but now they marked the path to this moment, a journey that reminded us that sometimes justice must roar to restore peace, and once peace returns, it stays, like the proud green shoots rising in the soil outside my home.